Chapter 45 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 45. During all these deliberations, not one word was said about the 500 unfortunate wretches between decks. It is a question whether even a thought was spent upon them, except by myself, perhaps by Ben Brace, and most likely the captain of the Pandora. But if the skipper thought of them, it was from no motives of humanity. Profit and loss were the only considerations that had any interest for him. And if he was thinking of the poor creatures with regret, it was not any regret for the horrid fate they were likely to meet with, but solely on account of the pecuniary loss he would sustain by their destruction. I feel certain that up to the moment when their future plans had been fully discussed and agreed upon, not one of that reckless crew had given a thought to the situation of the blacks. Had these human beings been so many head of cattle, they could not have entered less into the calculations that had been made. For they were not considered at all. Not one drop of water had been apportioned to their use. No suggestion of such a thing had been afforded. It would have been ridiculed as preposterous. It was only after everything had been settled that mention was made of them. Then a rough fellow cried out, in a tone of mock surprise that smacked of a disgusting levity, "Thunder and hounds, what's to be done with the niggers?" "Aye, aye," shouted several in a breath. "What's to be done with them? There's no water for them, that's certain." "Why, what can be done?" responded an inhuman monster. "Chuck 'em overboard." "Dunder and blitz!" exclaimed a ferocious German who appeared pleased with the idea. "That is the best plan. We's cannot do better than to clear them out from the ship." "Pergar," cried the Frenchman Legros. "It bid von great big drown? Von grand splash in the water? Sacre!" I cannot describe the feelings I had listening to this conversation. These men were actually serious, and yet jesting. It is almost too horrid to be credible, and yet it is true. But they were serious. I knew they were, and I expected every minute to hear that this horrible suggestion was adopted, and that the blacks were to be thrown overboard. But the villains were not unanimous, and for a length of time they continued to discuss the question in the same half-serious, half-jocular way. It was awful to listen to that inhuman debate. The slave captain's wishes, however, were opposed to throwing his cargo overboard, and notwithstanding the mutinous disposition of the men, he had still authority enough to carry the point. He was obliged, however, to humiliate himself by resorting to argument. His speech was characteristic, and throughout the whole of it there was not one word about humanity. He alleged that the niggers could only die anyhow, and a few days could make no difference to them. Neither could it signify to them, the crew, whether the blacks died of thirst or by drowning. They could throw them overboard after the breath was out of them all the same, but some of them might live it out. He had known niggers to stand it a long while without water. They could hold out much longer than white men, for in this respect they resembled the ostriches, camels, and other animals of their own country, that could go for whole weeks without drinking. No doubt many of them would die, and therefore be lost to him, but they would not die if they could help it, and there were still the chances that a good many would stick it out. These were the captain's words, till they had made land or overhauled some vessel, and though they might be pretty far gone, another phrase of the speaker, a drink of water would set their stomachs all right again. So ran the ruffian's speech. He further proceeded to point out to his audience the destitute condition that he and they would be in should they reach the Brazilian coast without a cargo. There would be no bounty, no spending money, nothing. Whereas, if they could only get there with even a portion of the Negroes alive, even 1 out of 5, 100 out of the whole lot, there would still be a large sum realized, and he promised that he would be liberal to all hands. It was absurd, therefore, to talk of flinging the cargo overboard. They could do no harm as they were. There could arise no danger, since they would keep the blacks securely under hatches, and therefore in every way it was better to let these hold out as long as they could, and take chance of bringing some of them to a market. Such was the skipper's speech, and I have followed his phraseology as nearly as I remember it. It was an awful harangue, and my heart sickened within me as I listened to it. Meanwhile, the ill-starred victims who were the subject of these deliberations were, happily for themselves, still ignorant of that horrid fate with which they were being threatened. A few of them, whose gaunt faces looked up through the grating, may have noticed that something was amiss, But ignorant both of the language and the ways of their tyrant jailers, they could not possibly have known the danger in which their lives were now placed. Alas, alas, they would soon learn, too soon. Soon they would experience the agony of thirst. Soon they would feel its horrid cravings. Even at that moment was it drawing upon them. Even then were they crying for water, for in consequence of the discovery that had been made, their morning's allowance had not yet been served to them, and water was always the thing they seemed most to covet and desire. Its scarcity was to them their greatest grief. Even at that moment, as I passed the hatchway, I could hear them calling for water, water, some in their native tongue, and others, in hopes of being better understood, in that language best known along the African coast, the Portuguese, repeating the word, agua, agua. End of chapter 45. Read by Dave Campbell, Burnaby, British Columbia, June 2023. Chapter 46 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ran Away to Sea by Mayne Reid. Section 46. Unhappy beings. I shuddered as I reflected on what was before them. They were to endure thirst in all its gradations, from the simple, scarce, painful longings for water, which most of them already felt, to the extremest agony and torture which that appetite can inflict. But a few days before, I had myself experienced thirst. But what signified that compared to what they would be compelled to endure? Simply nothing, a mere foretaste, that enabled me to judge how terribly painful thirst may become. Yes, I shuddered as I reflected on what was before them. Little did I dream how short was to be the period of their endurance. Little thought I, as I paced along the deck and listened to their cries for water, that their sufferings from thirst would soon be at an end. It was not their destiny to die from the want of water. Alas, a far more horrible doom was in store for them, a doom that I almost shudder to recount. As the day advanced, their cries for water, agua, agua, became more frequent and plaintive. There were some who shouted in anger, wondering why they had been denied their customary allowance. There were some who fancied it arose either from neglect on the part of their white tyrants, whom they saw moving about perfectly indifferent to their entreaties, or else from some capricious cruelty to torture and punish them. It is hard to say what might have been their imaginings, but many of them exhibited symptoms of fury, amounting almost to frenzy. They approached the grating with gestures of menace, and endeavored by main strength to force the strong woodwork from off the hatch. Some gnashed their teeth and frothed at the lips, beating their breasts with clenched fists and yelling their native war cries until their voices echoed far over the waters. To all these demonstrations the crew of the Pandora paid no heed, except that 2 sentries instead of 1 were placed over the hatchway where the male portion of the slaves were confined. This precaution was taken because it was now deemed possible that the Negroes might make their way upon deck, and should they succeed in doing so in their infuriated state, woe to the white men who had hitherto ruled them. Both sticks and bayonets were used freely upon the frantic creatures, until the carpenter with ready tools had strengthened the grating and battened it down, beyond the possibility of its being raised up or broken by those who were striving underneath. What added to the sufferings of the slaves, and also to the apprehension of the Pandora's crew, was that the wind had suddenly ceased, and it had fallen to a dead calm. The heat of the sun, no longer fanned by the slightest breeze, had grown intolerable. The pitch melted upon the ropes and in the seams of the deck, and every article, whether of hemp, wood, or iron, was as hot as if taken out of a fire. We had arrived in that part of the Atlantic Ocean known among Spanish seamen as the horse latitudes, because that there, during the early days of Spanish adventure, vessels often got becalmed, and their cargoes of horses, dying of the heat, were thrown overboard wholesale. This is one of the explanations given for the singular appellation, though others have been assigned. Into these horse latitudes, then, had the Pandora found her way, and the complete calm into which the atmosphere had all at once fallen was not only a source of suffering to all on board, but to the sailors an object of new apprehension. On first discovering the shortness of the supply of water, a calm sea was the very thing they had most dreaded. A storm they feared not to encounter. Through that, even though the wind were dead ahead, they could still make way. But in a calm, they could do nothing but lie quiet upon the hot bosom of the sleeping ocean, wasting their days and hours, wasting what was now more precious than all, their scanty supply of water. One and all were terrified at the prospect. They were all men who had made many a trip across the line, and had run the torrid zone both eastward and westward. They could read well the indications of the sky, and from its present appearance most of them foresaw, and were not slow to foretell, a long-continued calm. It might last a week, perhaps twice or 3 times as long. Sometimes there is a month of such windless weather in these latitudes. If it continued only for the shortest of these periods, then indeed would they be in danger, and no wonder they were freshly apprehensive. As the sun went down, his disk appeared red and fiery. There was not a cloud in the sky, not a curl upon the sea. It was the last time that sun ever shone upon the Pandora. When morning came, that bad but beautiful bark was a wreck upon the sea, a field of floating fragments. End of chapter 46. Read by Dave Campbell, Burnaby, British Columbia, June 2023.
Chapter 47 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ken Kowalik. Chapter 47. You desire an explanation. You wish to know how the Pandora was destroyed? In the closing passages of the preceding chapter, I ran ahead of my narrative. I shall now return to it. The night came down still, but not silent. At least not silent on board the slave ship. The cries of the ill-fated beings below still loaded the air, their voices growing hoarser and hoarser. The ruffians might cage their bodies, but they could not confine their tongues. And ever and anon rose that awful din, pealing along the decks, and echoing far out over the still bosom of the waters. It seemed at length to grow unendurable, even to the men, and those who had before advocated throwing the slaves overboard once more proposed adopting this course. The unexpected obstruction from the calm now added force to their arguments. They alleged there was no chance of the niggers holding out. They would all be dead in a couple of days, by suffocation as well as thirst. And why not settle the business at once? They had now to look out sharply for their own lives, and better they should not be bothered any longer with these squalling brutes. This was literally the language of one of those who advocated the drowning of them. It was enough to drive a man mad to hear them, and it would be only mercy to them, much the ruffian cared for mercy, to make short work of it, and then the poor devils would have it over at once. This was the compassionate speech of one. Another followed in a like strain, and said, interrogatively, "After all, what did it amount to? The cargo was not such a great matter so long as the ship was safe. What signified all the niggers had cost? What they might fetch was another matter. But a man could not call that a loss which he had never had. And therefore, all the loss the skipper should sustain would be the original outlay. It wasn't $1 million. He would soon repair the damage. Once they got the casks filled, they could return to Africa, and King Dingo was the man to find them a fresh cargo. Perhaps he would let them have it on credit, if they couldn't do better. At this improbability several laughed. But the skipper need not go begging for credit. He was not so easily broken up as that came to. If he himself was short, he had friends in Brazil, aye, and in Portsmouth too, who would soon find him the rhino. The speech of this able logician turned the scale and settled the question. And despite protestations and the entreaties of the slave captain and 1 or 2 others, it was decided that the Negroes should be thrown overboard. A few minutes were now given to a discussion as to the mode of effecting this purpose. It was finally agreed that the best way would be to remove a single bar from the grating, so that only one of the victims could come up at a time, and then, taking each aft out of sight of the hatchway, so that they might not be seen by the others, to seize one after another and cast them into the sea, whence there would be no fear of their returning. Doubtless many of them could not swim a stroke, and those that could would not swim long, amidst that multitude of voracious sharks that were beating around the bark. The ruse of this successively destroying the wretched victims, without making known to their companions below, originated in no ideas of mercy. It was a thought that sprang from simple convenience. The monsters knew that if those below were to get wind of the fate that awaited them above, they would no longer come on deck, and to have gone down amongst them to bring them up would have given trouble, and might have been attended with danger. It was heartbreaking to listen to the details of their plan, and I know that I could neither obstruct nor prevent it. Had I put in my voice either to appeal or protect the unfortunates, it is likely enough that I should have been myself the first morsel given to the sharks. I could do naught but suffer in silence. Indeed, I am not sure, had it been in my power at that moment to prevent them from carrying out their design, whether it would have been right to interfere. Clearly it would not have served the cause of humanity. A death of some kind was certainly in store for all these ill-starred beings, either a slow, lingering death by the torture of thirst, or one more rapid and far less cruel, such as that they were about to undergo. It might have been humanity to leave the ruffians to carry out their intent, and shorten the sufferings of their black victims by the easier death of drowning. I had such a reflection at the moment, but I had no time to dwell upon it, for just then a rush of men towards the slave hatchway told me that the monsters were actually on the way to carry out their diabolical purpose. They were on their way and would have proceeded in their intent. The carpenter was there with his axe to strike off one of the bars of the grating. He had already given a blow on the batten. Another would have been enough, and then the horrid scene would have begun. But at that moment a cry came from the after part of the vessel that caused the carpenter to suspend his work and look up in dismay. Those who surrounded him were startled as well as he, and all looked aft with terror painted on their faces. One and all were terrified by that cry, and no wonder they were. It was the cry of fire. The ship was on fire. End of chapter 47. Read by Ken Kowalik. Reddit, Ontario, Canada, May 5th, 2023.
Chapter 48 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 48. At this cry, all hands rushed toward the after part of the vessel. I ran with the rest. On reaching the quarterdeck, we found the black cook, Snowball, in the hands of the captain and mate, who were beating him with thick ropes and causing him to sing out at the top of his voice. Both were excited and angry, swearing loudly as they struck the blows, and already the man's back exhibited the keenness of their vengeance. Some of the sailors, still apprehensive about the cry of fire, which they had heard, demanded an explanation, which was immediately given. Snowball had gone down to the storeroom under the main cabin for the purpose of drawing brandy from a large cask of this spirit that was kept there. The only access to the storeroom was through a small hatch in the floor of the cabin itself, and as it was bulkheaded off from the rest of the hold, of course the place was quite dark. For this reason the cook had carried with him, as he always did on such occasions, a lighted candle. It was not clearly explained how he had mismanaged, for the black, as well as most of the crew of the Pandora, were, ever since the discovery about the water, in a state of half intoxication. Even at that moment it was evident that both mate and captain were nearly drunk, and gave but half-coherent replies to the eager inquiries of the men, who were still under apprehensions from the cries of fire that summoned them aft. The accident was afterwards explained by Snowball himself. It appeared that the brandy cask was without a regular tap or stopcock, and that the cook was in the habit of drawing the liquor through the bung-hole by means of an ordinary dipper. Somehow or other, of course through the black's drunken negligence, the burning candle had slipped from his fingers and dropped right into the bung-hole, and quick as a flash the spirit had caught fire, and smoke and flame issued in volumes through the hole. At first the cook, dreading chastisement, resolved not to make any alarm, but coming on deck provided himself as quickly as he could with a bucket of water. With this he returned, and pouring the water into the cask, endeavored by such means to stifle the flames. It was all to no purpose. The blue blaze flickered upward as before, each instant becoming stronger, as the brandy itself grew hotter, and more of the spirit caught the fire. It appeared that the cook had made several journeys back and forward from the storeroom to the deck before confessing to what had occurred, or warning any one of the peril in which the vessel was placed. At length, however, his frequent passing to and fro with the water bucket attracted the attention of the mate, and then the discovery was made that the brandy was on fire, for the black was now forced to confess the truth. Then it was that the cry of fire was raised, which had called the crew away from their demon purpose. From the behavior of the captain and his mate, it might have been supposed that the fire had been extinguished, and for a time such was the belief. Surely before setting on to belabor the culprit as they were doing, they had seen that the fire was out. Such would have been the natural conclusion, and so everyone judged. It soon came out that they judged wrongly. The two officers were half mad with drink and rage, and without attempting to get the fire under, they had set upon the black and were expending their anger in blows, while the latter kept howling at the top of his voice, mingling with his cries for mercy the more startling cry of fire. It was this that had so suddenly alarmed the crew. Was the fire out, or was it still burning? These were the questions that passed from mouth to mouth in quick and apprehensive utterance. As soon as it was ascertained where it had occurred, a rush was made into the cabin, the men crowding together through the entrance, and treading upon one another's heels in their haste to be assured of the truth and relieved of the terrible suspense. For there is no calamity on board a ship so much dreaded as fire. The suspense of the Pandora's crew was not of long duration. It became certainty, a certainty that the fire was not yet extinguished. On entering the cabin, they saw this at a glance. Thick sulphurous smoke was rising through the open hatchway, and the cabin was already filled with it. There must be fire to produce such a smoke, and fire still alive and active, for it was not the smoke of a fire that had been lately extinguished. No, it was still alive, still burning, still spreading and increasing. That was evident to all as soon as they entered the cabin, and saw the smoke issuing up through the hatchway. But if there remained any doubt on the mind of any one, it was soon removed, for at that moment a loud explosion was heard in the storeroom below, like a blank shot, or the bursting of a steam boiler, and almost simultaneous with the report, a gush of thick vapor, mingled with blue flame, came rushing up the hatchway. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Mayne Reid. Section 49. It needed no conjurer to explain that report. Everyone knew what it meant. It was caused by the exploding of the strong iron-bound cask, burst open by the gas engendered by the fire within. Of course, the spirit was now spilled over the floor of the storeroom and everywhere on fire, so that every combustible article within reach, and of those there were many, would soon catch the flame. There were dry barrels of biscuits, and quantities of bacon, hams, with lard, oil, and butter. It was remembered that there was a barrel of pitch, too, close to where the brandy cask had been kept. All these would catch freely and burn rapidly and readily, especially the barrel of pitch, the head of which was open. It was thought there was no gunpowder, for although there had been a large quantity of coarse blasting powder aboard, it was part of the original freight, and had all been delivered to King Dingo Bingo in exchange for the slaves. So at least was it supposed at the time, and this hypothesis served as a useful purpose, since it enabled the crew to act with more coolness than they would otherwise have done. There is no situation more calculated to destroy presence of mind than to be aboard a ship on fire, and to know that somewhere among the flames there is a barrel of powder. Of course, the crew of the Pandora did not stand idle or inactive. They ran in every direction in search of means to extinguish the fire. Buckets were collected from all parts of the deck, and water was procured from pumps and over the sides. This was heaved down the hatchway of the storeroom, bucketful after bucketful, but apparently without any good purpose. Still the flames raged, and the water did not reach them. At all events, it failed to extinguish them. Of course, no one dared venture below. The smoke and fire forbade it. Any attempt to go down would have been a rash sacrifice of life, and no one thought of making it. For nearly 10 minutes the men continued to draw water and dash it in buckets full down the hatchway, but all to no purpose. The fire gained strength. The smoke grew thicker and hotter from the pitch and other combustible substances that had now evidently caught the flames. It poured up in vast volumes till the cabin became filled. It was no longer possible to approach the hatchway, no longer possible even to enter the cabin. One or two who ventured in were half stifled before they had gone 6 feet inside, and came reeling back like men who are drunk. The buckets were thrown aside. They could no longer be of service, as no one could get near the hatchway to pass water down it, and it was of no use throwing it elsewhere. But the hour of despair had not yet arrived. Sailors are men who rarely yield to despair, at all events not while the slightest chance remains to beget hope. And bad as may have been their moral character, the crew of the Pandora were not cowards. Linked with 1,000 crimes, they had the one virtue of courage, though brute courage it may have been. Not yet did they despair. Other resources were now thought of. A piece of hose was attached to the spout of the pump and carried to the door of the cabin, and by means of this water was still poured in. But this contrivance proved unavailing. The mouth of the hose could not be got into the hatch, as it was impossible any longer to enter the cabin, and the water was spilled on the floor. It so chanced that the stern of the vessel sat high. The casks that had been emptied were all in the afterhold, while the full ones containing the sea water were stowed forward. Hence the bark was higher abaft than at the bows. For this reason the water thrown upon the cabin floor by means of the hose pipe, instead of remaining there, came running back towards the gangways as fast as it was poured in. This produced a new consternation, for the men had conceived hopes that, after deluging the cabin from the pumps, the water would run through the open hatch, and then extinguish the fire below. As soon as it was perceived that this purpose could not be accomplished, then, indeed, did symptoms of despair make their appearance upon the faces of the crew, and they began to turn their eyes upon one another with glances of interrogation and looks that proclaimed the knowledge that their plan had proved a failure. No one had the courage to say so, and the pumping went on, though it was evident from the slowness of the motion and the want of energy exhibited that the men who were working the handle were exerting themselves only with a sort of mechanical effort that would soon yield to despondency and despair. And so it yielded. Without any one saying a word, all seemed tacitly to have arrived at the same conclusion, that their efforts were idle, and all at once the pumping was suspended, the handle was dropped, the hose-pipe lay flattened along the deck, and the water ceased to flow. By this time the whole after part of the vessel was shrouded in smoke that had been oozing out of the door and windows of the cabin, and which, in consequence of the stillness of the night, was not carried away. Slowly it ascended into the air, and so straight upwards that the edge of the cloud had not yet approached the main deck, although the whole of the mizzen-mast was enveloped by the thick smoke and invisible to its very peak. Most of the quarter-deck covered, and the cabin was now completely hidden from view by the vapory volume that clustered above and around it. As yet there was no flames to be seen, but the hissing, crackling sound coming up from below, at intervals fell upon the ear, and told that the fierce element was still raging there, and would soon exhibit itself in all its red and terrific splendor. No one waited to watch its progress. No longer did any one think of attempting to extinguish or even to check the fierce destroyer. All hopes of saving the vessel were given up. The Pandora must be abandoned. And now was heard that heart-thrilling summons to the sailor, that last despairing cry, "To the boats! To the boats!" End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 50. There were 3 boats belonging to the bark Pandora. They were the longboat, the pinnace, and the captain's gig. These would have been enough to have carried the whole crew. Indeed, the longboat herself would have contained all hands, or nearly. 30 was reckoned her full complement, though in a case of distress 40 persons might have found room in her, and she would have floated with that number, though not in a rough sea. She had been a good boat in her time, but was now old and worn, and there was a rotten plank or two among her timbers. She was not the boat originally made for the Pandora. This had been lost in a gale, and the one now aboard was an old weather and water-worn veteran, hurriedly obtained for the voyage. The pinnace would have carried some 15 men, had she been fit to go into the water, which she was not. She had met with an accident while in the river, and had not yet been repaired. She was not slung at that moment, but lying in the scuppers along the main deck, where the carpenter had for days past been repairing her. The repairs, however, were not completed, and the boat could not go to sea. The longboat and gig, then, must take the whole crew, and it was agreed that 28 should get into the former, while the remaining 12 should be stowed in the gig. Of course, this agreement was made by a kind of rambling general consent, for there was no deliberation about anything, the whole crew being now half mad with haste and excitement. A large number of the men had rushed at once towards the longboat, and there I followed them. They soon swarmed up to the bulwarks and set to work to poise the davits outward, and get the rigging in order for lowering the boats. I did not see Brace among them, and fancying he might have gone with a party towards the gig, I started aft to find him, as it was my intention to go in whatever boat carried him. The gig was suspended at the stern, just under the taffrail, and to reach this point I had to pass through the smoke that enveloped the cabin. But although the atmosphere seemed perfectly stagnant, the cloud of smoke leant a little towards the larboard side, and on the opposite or starboard side the way was partially clear. I had observed one or more persons glide through towards the stern, and I followed them. On arriving upon the poop, I saw that there were 5 or 6 persons there, engaged in launching the gig. They were working with all their might, and apparently hurried by some extreme apprehension of terror. 3 of them I recognized as the captain, mate, and carpenter, and the others were men noted as their allies and firm friends. They had already lowered the boat nearly to the water, and just as I looked over the taffrail I heard the plash as her keel dipped into the sea. I saw that there were some articles, the compass with charts and a few other things like boxes or barrels, already lying in the boat, but as yet none of the men had got into her. On glancing at those who were around, I perceived that my friend was not among them, and I was turning to go back towards the main deck, when all at once the 6 men who had lowered the gig, I now saw that there were but 6, passed suddenly over the taffrail, and gliding down the davit tackle, dropped into the boat. Surely, thought I, they are not going to row off without their full complement of 12. That was the understanding, and it was further agreed that all hands should help in lowering the longboat before the gig should be launched. The latter, being small and light, could be got into the water in a few seconds of time, and 6 men would be enough, whereas launching the great longboat, getting her over the bulwarks, and then lowering her safely into the sea, was a work that required both time and the help of all hands. That all were to assist in it had been specially arranged, in the hurried consultation which had been held after the cry had arisen, "To the boats!" No doubt that those now engaged about the longboat supposed that all hands were there, for in a crowd of 40 men the absence of 5 or 6 is not readily noticed, and as it was no longer daylight, the faces of none could be easily distinguished. The mate and captain would not have been missed more than any others. Their authority existed no longer, and their silly behaviour in belabouring the cook, when they should have been using the time to better advantage by endeavouring to stifle the fire, had led to the belief that both were half seas over, and therefore no attention had been afterwards paid to any orders from either of them. It was they and the 4 men with them I had observed passing abaft as I was looking for Ben, and I thought at the time that they were sulking, as if they did not wish to be seen. As I stood upon the poop, the conjecture was confirmed. The 6 were evidently about to steal the gig away, without waiting for the others she was to have carried. I was irresolute how to act. I could not myself prevent them. Remonstrance from me would have been laughed at, and I had not the strength to stay them. To call out would have been of no use. The sound of the fire roaring and crackling below, the hoarse shouting of the men themselves, the yells and vociferations of the slaves forward, produced a medley of noises amidst which my cries would not have been heard, or, at all events, their object would not have been understood. Another thing, it was too late to create any noise about it, for before I could make up my mind to do one thing or the other, either to cry out or run back, the gig was resting on the water. The 6 runaways had dropped into her, and the next moment had cut the davit tackle and set the boat free. They appeared to act with extreme haste, as if they apprehended being hindered from getting off, or were afraid that more would come up and leap in along with them, so as to overload the boat. I could not comprehend why they were in such a desperate hurry. There could be no danger in the gig being overloaded, as it was agreed she could only take 12, and I knew that most of the crew would far prefer to go by the longboat, Moreover, there was as yet no danger from the fire, for although smoke was oozing out by the binnacle, it would be a good while before this part could be ablaze. There was no one by the wheel. The perfect calm that had continued since near morning rendered a steersman superfluous, and the wheel stood idle and neglected. The compass was gone. It was it I had observed in the bottom of the boat. I could not comprehend then why the captain and his 5 associates were in such a way to be off, and thus desert the rest of their comrades in misfortune. There was some mystery in it. There was a mystery, which in another moment was cleared up, and by the dastardly skipper himself. I was still standing by the taffrail when the davit tackle was cut, and saw the gig oars shoved out and ready to pull away. The skipper himself grasped the oar. At that moment he looked up and noticed me. He half rose from his seat, and in drunken accents hiccuped out, "Ahoy there, you boy, Bill! Tell 'em to look sharp in getting out the long sharp, d'ye hear? Let 'em be quick about it, quick, for by there's a barrel of powder aboard." End of chapter 50.
Chapter 51 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ran Away to Sea by Mayne Reid. Chapter 51. The astounding intelligence conveyed by the final sentence of this staggering speech deprived me, for the moment, of the power of motion. "A barrel of powder aboard!" These were his very words, and I had no reason to doubt that they were true. On the contrary, his behavior and that of those who were with him went far to prove their truth. On no other supposition could I account for their haste to be gone, but the hypothesis of the powder at once explained it. Beyond a doubt, the speech was true. There was a barrel of powder aboard. Both he and the mate were aware of it. The dastards had made a sort of compromise with their consciences in now declaring it. They had preserved silence about it until they were themselves safe. If they had divulged the secret sooner, the whole crew might have followed them into the gig, dreading to stay any longer on board, and, therefore, they might not have got off so snugly. Now, however, that they were themselves beyond danger, there could be no harm in letting the others know it, as it might quicken their efforts at escape. Of course, they did not desire to see their old associates blown into the air, if it could be helped without any risk to themselves, but they had taken good care to remove the risk before offering any hint about the probable catastrophe. The skipper, as soon as he had given utterance to the appalling speech, sank back upon his seat, and, pulling along with the rest, the gig moved rapidly away. I say that the astounding intelligence deprived me of the power of motion, and equally so of speech. It occurred to me to ask for an explanation, an additional averment as confirmation of its truth, but, before I could recover myself, it was too late. The boat was almost beyond hail. It would be no use shouting after. They would not hear, or, if they did, would not heed me. And what mattered it? For I could not doubt but what the man had said was meant as serious truth. Though not sober, he would hardly have jested then, and in such a fashion. The time and the circumstances were too solemn for jest, even for him, unfeeling fiend that he was. No, he had spoken but the truth, the simple truth. Beyond all hope of a doubt, there was a barrel of powder on board the Pandora. Where was it? In the storeroom, now filled with fire? Where else was it likely to be? On the half-deck? Or in the hold? No, not probable. None of us had ever seen it there. There had been no powder observed in any part of the vessel to which the common sailors had access. None since the cargo was delivered to King Dingo. It must, then, be in the storeroom, or in the captain's own stateroom? In either case, contiguous to the flames. In either case, close to where I was standing. The thought roused my senses from the state of stupefaction into which they had fallen. The idea of self-preservation gave me new energies, and I lost no time in hastening away from the spot. It was a mere instinct to place myself as far from the danger as I could. I sprang from the poop and ran forward upon the main deck. I was now at a loss as to how I should act. My first impulse had been to rush forward among the men and proclaim the intelligence communicated by the captain. I was on the point of doing so, when some good angel seemed to whisper, "Prudence." I was always considered a boy of quick parts, and the life I had been lately leading had wonderfully sharpened my intellect. Just then it occurred to me, if I divulged the terrible secret, it could do no good, but on the contrary, might beget great mischief. I saw that the sailors were exerting all their strength to get out the boat, and were making what haste they could. No power on earth could have caused them to go faster. The dread of the flames, now beginning to flow through the cabin windows, was stimulus enough. Any additional dread would only paralyze them. I determined, therefore, to keep the fearful knowledge within my own breast. I thought of imparting it only to Ben, and for him I now went in search. I soon discovered him. He was among a crowd up over the davits, working with all his might. I could not get near him, and of course could not communicate with him without being overheard by the others. I therefore resolved to remain sole possessor of the dread secret till a better opportunity offered itself. I set to work with the rest, heaving and hauling, but, amidst all, I had but one thought. I scarce knew what was going on, or what I was myself doing. I was, every moment, in expectation of that loud report, that horrible explosion that would fling us all into eternity. I worked mechanically and often wrong. Once or twice I caught myself hauling the wrong way. Some of them noticed this and rudely kicked me aside. Oh, the keen apprehension! The boat was at length cleared of the bulwarks and swung over the sea, and then the lowering commenced. This operation was not so difficult, and in a few minutes more she rested upon the water. The men gave a cheer at their success. Many at once glided into the boat, while others remained above and on the sides, passing down some necessary articles, some bread and water, such things as could be most readily got at. At this moment 2 men lifted between them a heavy barrel, and rolling it over the bulwarks, commenced lowering it downward. The size and shape of the barrel proclaimed its contents. It was a cask of rum, and its weight proved that it had never been broached, but was quite full of the potent spirit. No one objected to its being taken into the boat. There were no protesters in that crew, but several now offered to assist in lowering it down. A bight of rope was thrown around the cask, and the letting down commenced. It had scarcely balanced over the copper sheathing of the bulwark when the bight of rope, hurriedly cast around it, slipped off, and the heavy barrel fell with all its weight into the bottom of the boat. Not exactly into the bottom, but upon one side, a little below the water line as the boat lay. A heavy crash was heard, not the firm concussion of the barrel striking on the elastic timbers of the boat, but more as if something had broken underneath where it fell. The barrel had fallen angularly and endways, and the sharp projecting end of the oaken staves had struck between 2 of the ribs of the boat, and fair upon the face of her outside planking. As if the hand of a demon had guided it, the rum cask in its descent had fallen upon one of the decayed planks, and the crash that had been heard was the sound of the plank springing out of its bed and breaking crossways at the same time. A wild cry rose from out the boat, as those who were below saw the catastrophe that had happened. It was visible even from the deck above, for looking over I perceived a thick gush of water pouring through the side of the boat. Some of the men leaped out of her and came climbing up again, while others remained, endeavoring to staunch the hole, and with buckets that were now thrown to them, commenced bailing out. They did not continue long at this. It was clearly a hopeless task. The huge breach could not be mended, and the boat filled 10 times faster than they could bail her out. They soon abandoned the attempt, and, dropping the buckets, followed their companions up the side. In less than 10 minutes after, the long boat had gone to the bottom of the sea. A raft! A raft! End of chapter 51, read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, May 8, 2023. Chapter 52 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ran Away to Sea by Mayne Reid. Chapter 52. A raft! A raft! This was the cry that now echoed along the decks, while men were seen hurriedly seizing hold of spars, ropes, and axes. But there was another cry, and an angrier one. It arose from the few who had rushed towards the stern, in hope of themselves appropriating the gig, and whose disappointment at finding she was gone found vent in oaths and shouts of vengeance. They had no need to go aft of the burning cabin to make the discovery. Over the quarter the gig was seen, distinctly seen under the clear moonlight, several cable lengths from the bark, and fast rowing away. 6 forms were in the boat, 6 only, and the men at once knew that they were the captain, mate, and 4 of their favorites. No explanation was required. The behavior of those in the gig told the tale of itself. They had deserted their companions in distress, had basely stolen away. "Gig ahoy! Gig ahoy!" was screeched after the departing boat, but to no purpose. Those in the gig paid no heed to the hail, but only appeared to row faster away. They seemed to dread being followed by the longboat and overtaken, and well might they have a dread of it, for if the betrayed crew could have laid hands upon their citizen officers at that moment, they would have shown them but scant mercy. As for the latter, they were apparently rowing with all their might, as if they wanted not only to get beyond earshot of their old associates, but out of sight altogether. But like the ears of both captain and mate were keenly bent, and their eyes too, unfeeling as the hearts of both were, they must have been stirred in the anticipation of that awful catastrophe, which both surely expected. They might have wished for a time to be deprived both of sight and hearing. As I have said, there was a cry of vengeance along the deck. Some, who, but for the moment before, were skulking aft with a similar purpose, were now loud in their denunciations of the dastardly conduct of the officers, and, goaded by the 2 passions of disappointment and rage, shouted after them the most opprobrious epithets and bitterest threats. But the little boat was by this time far off upon the water, and the necessity for immediate action soon called the men from their idle demonstrations. All hands set to work at the formation of the raft. The ability and dispatch with which sailors can construct a raft would be almost incredible to a landsman who had never seen the thing done. It is not from mere concert or organization among themselves, though there is something in that. Not much, however, for well-drilled soldiers are as clumsy at such a work as farm laborers. Though the principal material of a raft be timber, the sailor with his rope will far sooner bind it together than the carpenter with his hammer and nails, and bind it far safer and sure. The rope is a sailor's proper weapon, and its use he understands better than all others. He knows at a glance, or by a touch, whether it be the thing for the purpose intended, whether it be too long or too short, too weak or too stout, whether it will stretch or snap, or if it will hold securely. He knows, as if by instinct, what sort of knot should be used for this, and what sort for the other, whether a reef knot, or a bowline, a diamond or an over-end, whether a clove hitch, a clinch, or a cat's paw. All these modes of splicing and trying, with 5 times as many more, are secrets only known to the sailor. And only he can rapidly cut down a mast, or detach a spar from its rigging and get them overboard without delay. The aid of a landsman would be of little service in operations like these. Like bees, the men went to work, every one of the 30 and 4. Some handled the saws and axes, some carried spare yards and spars, some with their knives attacked the running gear and provided the ropes. All were equally busy, all equally interested in the result. In a few minutes the mainmast came down with a crash, falling over the side, and grinding the bulwarks beneath it, as if they had been hurdles of reeds, and, in a few minutes more, its rigging was all cut loose, both running and standing, its shrouds and stays, sheets, braces, and lifts. The great mast, with its yards still attached, soon rested upon the water alongside the wreck, for the Pandora might now be called a wreck, and upon these, as a foundation, the raft was speedily laid. The spare spars and yards, the gaffs and booms, were thrown upon top, and soon lashed firm by those who had descended to the water, and who now found footing upon the huge floating mass of timber. Empty casks were bungeed and flung overboard, and these added essentially to the safety of the structure, and its capability of carrying a greater weight. Sails, too, were thrown loosely over all, and then, last of all, the biscuit and water, such quantities of each as could be found amid the confusion. At length the raft was deemed complete. It could not have exceeded 15 minutes from the sinking of the longboat until the cheering fact was announced that the raft was ready. End of Chapter 52, read by Nancy Cochran-Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, May 14, 2023. Chapter 53 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ran Away to Sea by Mayne Reid. Chapter 53. But, short as was the time, it appeared an age to me. With that dread secret shut up in my breast, every minute seemed an hour, and I knew not the moment that was to be our last. When the longboat went down, I had resigned all hope, not dreaming that a raft could be got ready before the explosion would take place. It is metaphorical to say that every minute seemed an hour, but so tardy did the time appear that I began to wonder why the awful event was so long delayed. Perhaps, thought I, the powder may be far down, covered over with other things, such as boxes and bales, and the fire has not yet been able to get at it? I knew that a barrel of powder, even when thrown into the midst of a red-hot fire, takes a considerable time to explode. An intense heat must be generated in the wood before the powder inside will ignite, and, for this reason, the barrel must be a good while exposed to the fire. Perhaps the flames had not yet reached it? Was this the reason why the catastrophe was delayed? Or was it that the powder was not in the storeroom, or the cabin either, or in the after part of the vessel at all? About its whereabouts the skipper had said nothing, and it was upon this point I had desired explanation as the gig rowed off. A knowledge of this might have been of the greatest importance, but the captain had not even thrown out a hint. What, after all, if there was no gunpowder on board? What if the men had meant it as a jest, ill-timed and unfeeling though it was? What if he had intended it not as a piece of pleasantry, but an act of refined cruelty? There were circumstances that favored this last supposition. For the preceding 20 hours he had been at loggerhead with the crew. Ever since morning, since the commencement of the water trouble, the men had been sulky and mutinous, and both mate and captain had been slightly treated, their orders, in most cases, altogether disregarded. In fact, both had been bearded and threatened, and several angry altercations had occurred between them and the crew. It was natural they should feel spiteful and desirous of having revenge, natural for such men as they were, and might it not be to gratify this feeling that the skipper had shouted back that gratuitous piece of intelligence that there was gunpowder on board? Fiendish as such conduct may appear, There was probability in the supposition. It would only be in keeping with the character of the man. I really began to hope that such might be the case, and it again occurred to me to seek Ben and communicate the secret to him. He would be more likely to know whether the skipper had spoken truly or in cruel jest, and, if the former, perhaps he might be able to guess where the dangerous material was concealed, and might yet be in time to move it beyond the reach of the fire. These reflections occupied me but a few seconds of time, and as soon as I had made them, I hurried over the decks in search of my friend, with the design of making the disclosure of my secret. I found him among the rest, busy about the raft. He was wielding an axe, and cutting away some of the sheeting of the bulwarks, to help in its construction. I caught him by the sleeve, and with a gesture drew him a little to one side. And then, in a whisper, I made known to him the parting speech of the captain. I saw that the announcement startled him. Brave man though he was, it was enough to bring the paleness to his cheeks, and cause him to stand, for some moments, speechless and irresolute. "You're sure he said that? Sure o' it, Will'm?" "Quite sure. They were his very words." "A barrel of powder aboard?" "He said it just as they rode off. I've been thinking he might have done it out of spite, to frighten us." "No, no, lad, it's true. Shiver me timbers, if it ain't. The powder, 'twas believed we turned it all over to King Dingo. Now I remember something. I thought I seed the skipper hide a barrel of it after it was counted out. He stole it from the nigger, for sartin. I thought so at the time, but warn't sure. Now I be sure. There be a barrel aboard, sure as we're livin'. Heaven o' mercy! We're lost, lad, we're lost!" The momentary relief, which I had experienced from my late conjecture, was at an end, and my apprehensions were now as acute as ever. It was no jest, then. The skipper had been in earnest. The gunpowder was on board, the stolen barrel, and for this theft we were now to be sacrificed while the thief himself had escaped. Brace stood for some seconds as if paralyzed with the intelligence I had given him. He seemed to watch and listen for the crisis, and so did I. After a short while, however, my companion recovered his presence of mind, and appeared busy thinking out some plan of deliverance. But a few seconds only was he silent, and then, making a sign for me to go after him, he glided towards the bows of the vessel. No one saw or followed us, and there was nobody forward beyond the windlass. At the moment, all were busy amidships in getting the great mast overboard and cutting away the strong ropes of the rigging. Brace continued on over the bow bulwarks until he had got between the bumpkin and the bowsprit shrouds, and close to the figurehead of the vessel. Here he stopped and beckoned me towards him. I crawled over and stood by his side. "Not a word, lad, not a word of what you've heard. It can do no good, but only harm. If they get to know it, they'll knock off work, every one of 'em, and then we must all either roast or drown. Let 'em go on with the raft, maybe there'll be time enough yet. Almighty grant that there may be, Will'm. For all that, 'tarn't no harm to try and save ourselves if we can. The powder's sure to be aboard the cabin, and we'll stand a better chance here for'ard. But we ain't going to stop here longer than we can help. Look sharp now, and give me a hand. These 2 planks will float us. You cut some rope, then, while I knock 'em off. There, cut clear the jib sheets and downhauls. That'll do. Quick, lad, quick!" Thus directing me, Brace, who had brought the axe along with him, commenced knocking off the great broad boards that stretched on both sides, from the bulwarks to the figurehead, and upon which the name of the vessel was painted. With a few strokes of the axe, the strong man was able to detach them, and, as soon as this was done, he slung them in the ropes I had already obtained, and lowered them down to the water. Climbing out upon the bowsprit, he next detached the dolphin striker, and it also was lowered down, while I made myself useful by cutting through the martingales, also the 4 topgallant and royal staves, that fastened the spar in its place. Several other pieces of timber yielded to the axe, and all, having been thrown downward, floated together upon the motionless surface of water. Brace, now perceiving that there was enough to make a raft to carry the two of us, flung the axe into the shrouds, and gliding down a rope upon the floating timbers, called upon me to follow him. It was at this moment I heard the cry from the main deck that the great raft was ready, and, looking back, I perceived that the men were hurrying over the side and descending upon it. If I remained but a moment longer, I should be the last upon the burning wreck. No, not the last. Far from it. There were nearly 500 more. 500 human beings on board the Pandora, and though they were men with black skins, they had lives to lose, lives as precious to them as ours were to us. A terrible spectacle was comprehended in that backward glance, a sight, the remembrance of which never fails to send a chill through my veins and a shuddering through my frame. End of chapter 53, read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, May 14, 2023.
Chapter 54 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 54. During all this time, what was the behavior of the unfortunate blacks? Where were they? What were they doing? What was being done for them? Were any steps being taken for their safety? The two last of these questions may be answered by saying that up to that moment, with the exception of myself, perhaps, not one on board had given a thought either to them or their fate. With regard to their whereabouts, they were still between decks and under grated hatches, and as to what they were doing, it would have been hard to tell that, hard even to guess it. One thing they were doing, they were crying frantically and screaming as if they had all gone mad. But this was no new thing. It had been their behavior throughout that whole day. In their hurrying to and fro while launching the longboat, and afterwards while gathering materials for the raft, the men passed frequently near them, and then the cries of the blacks would, for the moment, be uttered in a louder voice and in more earnest tones, sometimes of entreaty, but oftener of rage and menace. As no notice was taken of them, and those to whom they appealed passed carelessly on, their voices would sink again into the deep continuous murmur of despair. It is probable that up to this period, the moment when the raft was ready, the only agony which they had experienced was thirst, for I noticed, on last passing them, that their cries had not changed. It was still agua, agua, water, water. This, with the want of air and room, the desire to get upon deck, were the impulses that had been urging them to such furious and frantic demonstrations. It is most probable, then, that up to the period I have mentioned, they had no particular dread, at least no dread of the awful doom that now threatened them so nearly. The smoke of the burning cabin rather inclined aft than forward, and had not reached them, and the flames were not yet sufficiently bright to illumine the whole vessel with any unnatural light. Of course, from their position under the hatches, neither cabin nor deck was visible to them, and until either smoke or flame, or a brilliant light shining through the grating, should reveal the awful truth, they could not possibly be aware of their peril. No one had volunteered to announce it to them, because no one thought it worth while. They may have observed that all was not right. They may have had suspicions that there was something amiss. The unusual movements of the crew, the noises heard upon deck, the hurried trampling of feet, and the gestures of the sailors, as these passed within sight, with the terrified expression of their countenances, which could scarce have been unnoticed, for it was still clear enough for that. All these matters must have excited the suspicions of the close-kept crowd, that there was something amiss on board the bark. The crashing sound of axes, and then the shock and heavy lurching of the vessel as the mast came down, may have excited other apprehensions besides that of perishing by thirst. And though they continued their cries for water, I observed that they conversed among themselves in hurried mutterings that bespoke alarm from some other cause. But as none of them knew anything about a ship or her ways, the Pandora was the first they had ever looked upon, of course they could not arrive at any conclusion as to why the unusual movements were going forward. Guided only by what they heard, they could hardly guess what was being done. They could not imagine there was a danger of being wrecked, since there was neither wind nor storm, and after all it might be some maneuver in navigation which they did not comprehend. This probably would have been their belief had they not observed the odd look and gestures of such of the sailors as at intervals came near the grating. These were so wild as to convince them that something was wrong, that there was danger aboard. The commotion had produced fears among them, but not proportioned to the peril. They knew not the nature of their danger, and their alarm had not yet reached its crisis, but they were not destined to remain much longer in doubt. Just at this moment a jet of red flame shot upward through the smoke. It was followed by another, redder and more voluminous, then another and another, until the blaze rose continuous and stood several feet in the air. The moon became eclipsed by the brighter light. The whole vessel was yellowed over, as if the sun had returned above the ocean. The crackling of the burning timber now sounded in their ears. The fire, having escaped from the embrace of its own smoke, seethed fiercer and rose higher into the air, until the top of the ascending flames could be seen through the grating of the hatches. But it needed not that the flames should be seen. Their light and the hissing, crackling noise that proceeded from them proclaimed the dread nature of the catastrophe. There arose a cry, a wild, agonizing cry, out of the bosom of that dark hold, out of the hearts of that ill-fated crowd, a cry that for some moments drowned the fierce seething of the flames, and the crashing, crackling sounds of the fire. I shall never forget that cry. None who heard it could fail to remember it till their last hour. It was just at this crisis that I had turned to look back. Awful was the sight that met my eyes, awful the sounds that fell upon my ears. Under the bright gleam of the blazing ship, I saw the black faces and round woolly heads pressing against the bars of the grating. I saw glaring eyes, foaming lips, and teeth set in terror, glittering white under the coruscation of the flames. I saw smoke oozing up the grated hatch. The fire was fast creeping forward. Its foul harbinger was already among them. Oh, what an awful sight! I could not bear it. I could not have borne it in a dream. It was too much for human eyes, too much for the heart of man. My first impulse was to turn away and glide down beside my companion, who was waiting patiently upon the raft below. This was my first impulse, which suddenly gave way to another. My eye had fallen upon the axe, still lying across the bowsprit shrouds where Brace had thrown it. The weapon suggested a purpose, and eagerly seizing it, I faced once more towards the burning vessel. My purpose was to return on deck, strike off the batten, and set the grating free. I knew the risk. I had forgotten the presence of the powder, but if it were to be my death, I could not restrain myself from acting as I did. I could not live to behold such a terrible holocaust, such a wholesale burning of human beings. At least, thought I, they shall not perish thus. Though their fate be sealed, they shall have a choice of death. They shall choose between burning and drowning. The latter will at least be easier to endure. It was this last reflection that had prompted me to my purpose. Bending downward, I hurriedly communicated my design to my companion. I was gratified with his reply. "All right, Will'm. Good work. Do it. Do it. Set 'em free, poor creeters. I was thinking on't myself, though 'twas too late. Hasty, lad, look sharp." I waited not for the end of his speech, but springing back to the deck, rushed towards the hatch. I thought not of looking below. Indeed, the smoke was now coming up so thickly that I could scarce see the terrified faces. The glimpse I had of them was sufficient to satisfy me that in a few minutes more those glaring eyes would have been blind, and those hoarse voices hushed in death. I remembered where one batten had been removed, and where the other had been attacked by the axe. I renewed the attack, striking with all the strength and dexterity I could demand. My efforts proved successful, and after half a dozen blows the spikes yielded, and the cleat of timber flew off. I did not stay to raise the grating. I knew that would be done by the pressure from below, and gliding back, I once more climbed over the bows. One glance back as I passed over the head told me that my purpose had been fully accomplished. Instantly as I parted from it, the grating was flung off, and I saw the stream of black forms pouring upwards and spreading itself over the deck. I stayed to observe no more, but sliding down a rope, was received in the arms of my companion. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 55. During my short absence, Brace had not been idle. He had got his little raft compacted, its timbers tied together, and it now carried us both without even dipping under water. The two spars, the Dolphin striker, and half of the spritsail yard were laid parallel to each other, and transversely to these were the broad pieces that exhibited in large letters the name of the ill-fated bark. There were several other pieces of timber, a handspike or two, and an oar, which Brace had picked up as he glided towards the head, and over all was a piece of sailcloth or tarpaulin. The hull formed a raft just about large enough for two, and safe enough in calm weather, but under a gale or even a strong wind, such a structure would have been overwhelmed at once. But my companion had no intention of going to sea with such a craft. His idea had been that he might get it ready before the great raft could be finished, and the sooner escape from the dangerous proximity of the powder. Even if it had taken him quite as long to prepare it, there was still a greater chance of safety by our being so far forward upon the vessel. If the powder had exploded, there would have been a chance of our not being blown to atoms. The after part of the vessel might be shivered in pieces, and, of course, the rest would soon sink. But still, by keeping out by the head, there were many chances in our favor. It was from these considerations that the sailor had hurried away from amidships, and set to making his raft at the bows. It was only intended as a temporary retreat, to enable us at the earliest moment to get beyond the circle of danger, and, should the men succeed in completing the larger structure, ours could afterward be brought alongside and joined on to it. The large raft was completed as soon as our little one, and all hands had gone down upon it. As I returned on deck to strike up the hatch, I saw not a soul of the Pandora's crew. They had all gone out of the vessel, and betaken themselves to the raft. From the deck I could not see either them or the raft, as the latter was still close in under the beam ends of the bark. As soon as I had got fairly down, my companion pushed off, and the next moment the great raft came under our view. Both it and those who were on it were seen as distinctly as though it had been daylight, for the burning vessel was no longer a combination of flame and smoke. Her whole quarter deck, from the taffrail to the main hatch, was enveloped in a bright flame that illumined the surface of the sea to the distance of miles. Under this light we perceived the raft and the men standing or crouching upon it. They had pushed off some 10 or 12 yards from the side of the vessel, in order to be clear of the flames. There was another reason that induced them to get some distance away, and that was the fear that there might be powder aboard. Although no positive alarm had been given to that effect, there existed a doubt about the thing, and they were not without apprehensions. There were other men besides Brace who knew something, or had heard something about the stolen keg, but who, not being certain about the matter, did not like to make known their suspicions. There might be powder yet, and it was, therefore, with a feeling of relief that all hands had sprung upon the raft, and got it out of the way of such dangerous contingency. No doubt it was this suspicion about the gunpowder that had influenced them all to exert themselves so strenuously in the work. So far as there was any danger from the flames, they might have continued on board a while longer, for it would still be many minutes before the conflagration could extend forward and embrace the hull of the vessel. The men had not stayed aboard a moment longer than was required for them to complete the necessary work, and once on the water they were seen to be working as anxiously as ever to push off the raft, as though they dreaded contact with the bark from some other cause than the danger of the fire. This was in reality the case, for now that the raft was fairly afloat, those who suspected the presence of gunpowder were heard freely declaring their suspicions, and all stood looking upon the conflagration with eyes of expectancy, expecting every moment to hear an explosion. It was just at that moment that Brace and I, passing round the larboard bow, came in sight of the crew, and without a moment's hesitation, my companion using the oar, and I doing what I could with a handspike, set our little raft in motion, directing it as well as we could towards the other, with which we supposed in a few seconds we should be able to come up. In this, however, we were disappointed. Just then we observed a strange movement among the men on the raft, who, after standing for some seconds in attitudes that betokened surprise, and with voices and gestures that confirmed it, were seen hastily renewing their efforts to put themselves at a still greater distance from the wreck, and not only hastily, but in a manner that bespoke some degree of terror. What could this mean? Surely the flames could not reach them now. Surely they were beyond all danger from an explosion of gunpowder. Even had there been 100 barrels instead of one, the blowing up of a whole magazine could not have harmed them at that distance off. Surely it was not this that was exciting them. I first looked to Brace for explanation, but his actions at the moment were as mysterious as any. He was on the forward part of our little craft, kneeling upon the planks, and using his oar in the manner of a paddle. I saw that he was endeavoring to direct our course towards the raft. So was I with the handspike. But my companion, instead of working leisurely and deliberately, as he had hitherto been doing, was now rowing with all the haste and strength he could put into his arms, as if he was in dread that the raft would get away from us, and was doing his utmost to overtake her. He had said nothing as yet, but I could see his features distinctly under the brilliant light, and the expression upon them, as well as the earnest endeavors he was making to increase our speed, convinced me that he, too, was under some feeling of terror. Was it the fear of being left behind by those on the raft? No, it could not be that, for though neither was going faster than a cat could swim, we were evidently making better speed than they, and it was plain we were getting nearer them at every stroke of the paddle. The great raft, indeed, lay like what it was, a raft of logs, and although the men had oars, it was only with great difficulty it could be pushed along, and moved slowly and heavily through the water. Why should Brace be at all uneasy about our overtaking it? But it was not that was urging him to such haste. The conjecture only held possession of my thoughts for an instant. In the next instant I perceived the cause of terror. I saw what alarmed both my companion and the crew upon the raft. End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 56. Up to that instant I had not looked back towards the burning bark. I would rather not have done so. I dreaded to look back. Moreover, I was so eagerly employed in helping to propel our floating plank that I had scarce time for looking around. Now, however, I was constrained to raise my head and glance back upon that terrific spectacle. It explained at once why the crew of the Pandora were so eager to be gone from the spot. The fire had burned forward to the stump of the mainmast, and, fed by the large quantities of black pitchy ropes, the shrouds, stays, and ratlines were sending up strong bursts of smoky flame. Red tongues were shooting out forward, as if to grasp the rigging of the foremast that still stood untouched. But the most singular, or rather the most awful part of the scene was that presented on the foredeck and the whole forward part of the ship. Upon the windlass, the bulwarks, the foremast shrouds, around the head, and out to the bowsprit end, was a continuous swarm of human forms, so thickly clustered that scarce any part of the vessel could be seen, except the foremast, with its spars and rigging towering high above. 500 there were, perhaps not so many, as some of them, happily for themselves, had gone out of the world before that dread hour. But nearly 500 there were, and of course they covered every part of the forward deck, and even the sides and bulwarks, from the selvage of the approaching flames to the bowsprit end. Some had gone out even farther, and could be seen swarming like bees, and balancing their bodies on the jib boom. In fact, but for its awful character, the scene suggested the hiving of bees that had crowded every leaf and twig upon the branch of a tree. Both males and females were there, for both had succeeded in making their way on deck. But amid that thick swarm their sex could not be distinguished. Strange to say, they were no longer black. Not one of them looked black. On the contrary, they appeared red. Their faces, the skin of their naked bodies, even the woolly coverture of their crowns, showed blood red under the glaring light of the blazing pitch. And this singular transformation added not a little to rendering the scene more terrific, for there was something supernatural in this altered complexion. The whole scene might have been compared to the final of some grand theatrical spectacle. It had all the grandeur, the red light, and the scenic embellishment, but in two circumstances it widely differed from the fictitious imitation. There was not that variety of forms and colors in the tableau, and, moreover, the characters were not as upon the stage, in poses and attitudes that betokened rest. On the contrary, all were in motion. Their arms were tossing wildly above their heads, while they themselves were leaping upward or dancing to and fro wherever they could find footing. They were shouting in tones of despair, screaming in agonized accents, while some, who had evidently gone mad, were gibbering and laughing in voices that bore a striking resemblance to that of the hyena. The strong light enabled me to trace everything minutely, alas, too minutely. I could see the white gleaming teeth, the frothing lips, the eyes glaring in madness or terror. We were still scarce a cable's length from them. I could note every movement as if I had been in their midst, or within 10 feet of them. They all stood fronting in the direction of the raft, and for this reason I could note their gestures, and even distinguish the expression upon their features. Among other things I saw women. I knew they were women only from their being smaller than those around. I saw women lift up little dark forms as high as they could raise them, and hold them out in the direction of the raft. They were their children, their infant pickaninnies, and this was intended as a supplication to the white runaways to come back and save them. Others stretched forth their arms and stood in attitudes of entreaty, while men, the stronger and fiercer ones, shook their clenched fists in the air, and hurled after us loud cries of menace. Awe-inspiring as was the spectacle, it was neither the threats of the men nor the supplications of the women that was causing all commotion among the crew on the raft. Part of the blaspheming and loud talk that could be heard there arose from anger that the blacks had been let out, and we could hear several voices inquiring, in harsh angry tones, "Who has done it? Who has done it?" These questions were not asked simply thus, but with the embellishments of horrid oaths and exclamations that cannot be repeated. It was just as my companion and I were parting from the bows that we heard these questions asked, and so earnest was the tone of the inquirers that I at once saw that I had placed myself in a position of danger. It appeared that I had committed an imprudence. My humanity had hurried me to an act that could be of no service in saving the lives of those I intended to benefit, and was likely to bring destruction upon all, myself among the rest. I can scarce say that I repented of what I had done. I should have done the same deed again. I could have not restrained myself. I had followed the promptings of mercy. How could I have acted otherwise? I had such reflections at the moment, or something like them. I cannot exactly describe my thoughts, for a tumult of strange emotions was passing through my mind. I now perceived the danger which threatened the two rafts. I perceived it on looking back toward burning the vessel. The blacks were threatening to swim after, and seek refuge upon the rafts. Large numbers of them showed that they had formed this intention. It was apparent from their movements and attitudes. They were swarming over the bulwarks and down the sides. They had gathered along the beam ends, and seemed every moment on the eve of launching their bodies into the water. End of chapter 56.
Chapter 57 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. No wonder the sailors were alarmed. Should the blacks carry out their intention, enough of them might reach the raft to sink her, enough of them perhaps to fling the white men into the sea, and themselves take possession of that frail chance for life. Whatever might be the event, it was clear that if they came on, certain destruction must result to one or other, or most likely to all. As for my companion and myself, we appeared in a position of greater peril even than those upon the raft, for we were between them and the threatened danger. But we had no fears from this source. We were certain that if no accident arose to our craft, we could propel it faster than a man could swim, though so little faster that it would have been a tight race had we been pursued. However, having so many yards of start, we had little to fear. We kept on, intending to overtake the raft and fasten our floating planks alongside it, and this purpose, after a few minutes, we succeeded in effecting. Brace had cautioned me, as we came up, to say nothing of what I had done. "For your life, say nothing, for certainly," said he, "they will throw you into the sea, and me along with you. Say not a word," whispered he, as a final caution. "Not a word, even if they question you. I'll answer them if they do." He was called upon to do so, and dexterously did he execute his design. "Hilloa!" hailed several as we approached. "Who are ye?" "Ho, Brace and that precious boy Bill. Was it you that let the niggers above board? Was it either of you?" These questions were put with the usual vulgar embellishments. "No," responded Brace, in an indignant tone, and, of course, telling the truth as far as he was concerned. "How could we? We were down by the bows, and couldn't see 'em. I wonder how they did get loose. They must have broke through when ye knocked off the batten. I seed nothin' of 'em till we were out in the water. I was under the head making this bit of raft. I was afeard there wouldn't be room for all. Lend a hand here, one of ye, and hitch this thing on. It'll help to keep a couple of us afloat anyhow." By this appeal for help, my companion dexterously turned the conversation, so that no further questions were asked about who set free the blacks. Indeed, there was no opportunity to talk any more upon the matter, for at this crisis the attention of every one upon the raft had become earnestly fixed upon that dark red cloud that clustered along the side of the vessel. Strange to say, the negroes had been for some minutes in this position, with every appearance of a purpose to leap outward into the water and swim towards the raft, and yet not one of them had sprung forth. They seemed like men determined to do a thing, but who waited for a signal from some leader. Either that or someone to take the lead himself and set the example, just like a mob of soldiers crowded together on the field of battle, as soldiers always are at such times, prepared to charge forward and rush even upon death itself, if some bold spirit will only give the word and go forward in advance of them. So stood the crowd of blacks, threatening to plunge into the sea and yet hesitating to do so. We wondered at their hesitation. What could they mean by holding back? The raft appeared the only chance for their lives, though a poor respite it would be. Nevertheless, men who are about to be burned or drowned will cling to a less hope than that. Why then did they not jump overboard and swim after, as all expected them to have done before this? Could they swim, or could they not? These were the questions that now passed rapidly from mouth to mouth on board the raft, and were answered with equal rapidity, though the answers were but guesses and did not correspond. They were both negative and affirmative. Some alleged that they could not. If this were true, then the position of affairs could be explained at once. The hesitation of the blacks to take to the water would, upon this hypothesis, be easily understood. However, there were but few who held this opinion. It was quite improbable that it could be the true one. Quite improbable that in all that crowd there was not any one who could swim, for even one would have taken to the sea in hopes of finding refuge upon the raft, forlorn as the hope may have been. No, the negative supposition was not to be entertained for a moment. It is well known that most of the natives of Africa not only swim, but are most excellent swimmers. Their mode of life renders the art a necessity among them. Living on the banks of great rivers, by the shores of those immense lakes in which Central Africa abounds, often requiring to cross streams that are deep and rapid, and where no bridges exist, these people are compelled by their very wants to become expert swimmers. Besides, their hot climate renders the exercise a pleasant one, and many tribes of them spend half their time in the water. It was highly improbable that they could not swim, all or nearly all of them. No, this was not the cause of their hesitancy. And what was? The question was answered by one of the sailors, though all of us at the same moment perceived the cause. "Look yonder!" cried the man, pointing along the water. "Look yonder! Yon's what cows 'em, the sharks." End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 58. The stretch of water that lay between the raft and the burning vessel glittered under the yellow light like a sea of molten gold. On its calm surface the blazing bark was mirrored as though another was on fire below, but the perfect image was broken by occasional rippling, as if some living creatures were stirring through the water. The very intensity of the light, dazzling our eyes, prevented us from scanning the surface with any degree of minuteness. It was like looking against the sun as the bright orb rises and sets over the sea. The strong light glancing along the water produced a sheen and a sparkle that half blinded us, and although we had observed an occasional eddy or rippling motion upon the surface, we had not thought of the cause until that moment. Now, however, that our attention was called to this moving of the waters, we had no difficulty in making out the cause. It was the sharks that were darting about, now rushing impatiently from point to point, now lying in wait, silent and watchful like cats, ready to spring upon their prey. Here and there we could see their huge dorsal fins standing like gaff topsails above the surface, now cleaving the water like huge blades of steel, anon dipping below to appear again at some point nearer to their expected prey. From the number of these fins that we observed above water, we came to the conclusion that there must be hundreds of these ferocious creatures around the blazing bark. In fact, there was a perfect school of them, like porpoises or minnows. For the longer we gazed, the greater number of fins and rippling eddies were detected, until at times it appeared as if the whole surface was thickly covered with these preying fish. Their numbers, too, seemed to be continually increasing. On looking out to sea, others might be noticed swimming up, as if they had come from a distance. No doubt that red conflagration was a signal that summoned them from afar. Like enough the sight was not new to them. It was not the first time they had witnessed the burning of a ship, and had been present at the spectacle. Before now they had assisted at the denouement, and were ever after ready to welcome such a catastrophe, and hasten towards it from afar. I really could not help thinking that these monsters of the deep possessed some such intelligence as they swam around the fated bark, casting towards it their ogreish, expecting looks. They came around the raft as well. Indeed, they appeared to be thicker there than elsewhere, as though we who stood upon it were to be the prey that would first fall into their ravenous jaws. So thick were they that 2 or 3 could be seen side by side, swimming together as though they were yoked, and at each moment they grew bolder and came nearer to the timbers. Some already swam so close to the raft that they were within reach of a blow from the handspikes, but not any one attempted to touch them. On the contrary, the word was passed around for no one to strike or assail them in any way. Just then they were doing good work. They were to be let alone. Little as the sailors would have liked to see such shoals of these dreaded creatures at any other time, for between sailor and shark there is a constant antipathy. Just then the sight was welcome to them. They knew that they themselves were out of reach of the hideous monsters, and at a glance they had comprehended the advantage they were deriving from their presence. They saw that they were the guardians of the raft, and that but for them the blacks would long since have taken to the water and followed it. The fear of the sharks alone restrained them, and no wonder it did, for the whole surface of the sea between the blazing vessel and the raft now seemed alive with these horrid creatures. It was no longer wondered at that the negroes had not precipitated themselves into the water and swam after us. It would have been a bold leap for any of them to have taken, a leap, as it were, into the very jaws of death. And yet death was behind them, death quick and sure, and perhaps, of all others the most painful, death by fire. In setting the poor wretches free, I had been under the humane impression that I had given them the easier alternative of being drowned. I now saw that I was mistaken. No such alternative was in their power. There was no longer a choice between burning and drowning. It now lay between burning and being devoured by the sharks. End of chapter 58. Chapter 59 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 59. An awful alternative it was, and for a long while the ill-fated victims seemed to linger in their choice. Hard choice between two horrid forms of death. Little did it matter which, and the knowledge of this rendered them indifferent whether to spring forth or stand still. Death was before them as well as behind. Turn which way they might, death stared them in the face, soon and certain, and on every side they saw its threatening arm, before, behind, above, and around them. The utter hopelessness of escape had numbed their energies. They were paralyzed by despair. But even in the hour of the most hopeless despair, there arrives a crisis when men will still struggle for life. It is the last struggle, the final conflict, as it were, with death itself. No one yields up life without this effort, though it be ever so idle. The drowning man does not voluntarily permit himself to sink below the surface. He still strives to keep afloat, though he may not have the slightest hope of being rescued. The effort is partly involuntary. It is the body that still continues to battle for life, after the mind has resigned all hope, the last stand that existence makes against annihilation. It may be a purely mechanical effort. Perhaps it is so. But whoever saw a strong man compelled to part suddenly with life that did not make such a struggle? Even the condemned criminal upon the gallows continues to strive till the breath has parted from his body. Something like this last despairing effort aroused the energies of that hesitating crowd that clustered upon the burning bark. The crisis at length came. The flames were fast rushing forward and spreading over all the deck, their red jets, spurting out beyond the selvage of smoke, began to touch the bodies of their victims and pain them with the fierce sting of fire. It produced no augmentation in their cries of agony. These had long since reached the climax, and the voices of those who uttered them had been already raised to the highest pitch. But the close proximity of the flames and the absolute certainty of being now destroyed by them caused a general movement throughout the living mass, and as if actuated by an universal impulse, or guided by one common instinct, all were seen making a sudden descent upon the water. Those who had been hitherto standing along the side were not the first to leap. It was they who were farther back, and of course nearer to the flames, who first took to the water, and these, rushing over the bulwarks, and even stepping upon the shoulders of those who were clustered there, without further hesitation, flung themselves headlong into the sea. But the impulse seemed to communicate itself to the others, and almost instantaneously, as if someone had proclaimed a way to safety and was leading them onto it, the whole crowd followed the foremost and went plunging into the water. In a few seconds not an individual could be seen. Of all that dark swarm that had so lately crowded the forepart of the vessel, not one was now visible on board. Simultaneously had they deserted the burning wreck. A wild scene was now presented in the water. The whole surface was thick with human forms, plunging and struggling together. Some were evidently unable to swim, and with their bodies half erect, were tossing their arms about in vain efforts to keep above the surface. Here and there several clung together, until 2 or 3, or in some instances larger groups, dragged one another below and sank to the bottom together. Strong swimmers were observed separating from the rest, and forging out into the open water. Of these the heads only could be seen, and rapidly closing upon them the dark vertical fin that told the presence of the pursuing shark. Then could be heard the wild, despairing cry. Then could be seen the quick rush of the monster upon his prey. The water lashed by his tail, the foam thrown up, already tinged with the blood of the victim, and after that, the surface returning to its level, the eddies and red frothing bubbles alone marking for a few moments the scene of each tragical crisis. Oh, it was an awful spectacle to look upon, this wholesale ravening of sharks, and even those who were upon the raft, with all their inhumanity and heartless cruelty of disposition, could not behold it without emotion. It was scarce an emotion of pity, however. Perhaps of all, Brace and I were the only ones who felt pity. Some were indifferent, but the majority of them, although a little awed by the tragical scene, were actually glad at beholding it. It may be wrong of me to say they were glad. What I mean is that they felt a secret satisfaction at what was going on, springing not from pure wanton cruelty of heart, but rather from an instinct of self-preservation. Hitherto these men had been in great dread of the blacks overtaking the raft. They were not yet free from the fear, and of course, with this in their minds, they regarded with satisfaction the wholesale ravage that the sharks were committing. By this, their own danger was every moment diminished. Hence it is that they were gratified at the hideous spectacle. But numerous as were the sharks, there were not enough of them to make total destruction of that vast crowd of human beings. After the first general attack, the ravenous brutes appeared to become scarcer and scarcer, until but one here and one there could be seen rushing upon their prey. The greater number, having already secured a victim, were satisfied, and perhaps had gone down to their haunts in the darker deep, while hundreds of human heads were still observable above the surface of the water. The flames, still flaring brilliantly, illumined the sea, as if the day was shining upon it, and it could be observed that the faces of the survivors were all turned in the direction of the raft, towards which they were swimming with all their strength. Once more the sailors became inspired with apprehension. Once more they dreaded that their last hour was come, and that they themselves might soon be struggling among the sharks. End of chapter 59. Chapter 60 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 60. There was much shouting among the white men and many wild exclamations, But no time was lost in idle talk, for everyone was doing his best to propel the raft. The shouts were only an accompaniment to their actions. Nearly every one wielded some implement which had been grappled in the hurry of the moment. Some were provided with oars, others had only handspikes, and still others assisted in paddling with pieces of board that had been obtained from old coops, or the bulwarks broken by the falling mast. Those who could find nothing better stretched themselves along the edge of the raft and beat the water with their hands, in order to aid in producing a forward motion. But the great masses of timber, not yet firmly lashed together, lay loose and loggish upon the water, and moved very slowly and irregularly under such ill-assorted propulsion. And notwithstanding that the raft had obtained 100 yards the start of the swimmers, its occupants began seriously to dread being overtaken. They had reason to fear it. There could be no doubt that the pursuers were gaining upon us, and this soon became evident to all upon the raft. Nay, more, they were gaining rapidly, and at the rate at which they were swimming, 5 minutes could not pass before they would overtake us. Those upon the raft were now quite conscious that such would be the event. Paddle and beat the water as they might, they could not propel the heavy timbers beyond a certain rate of speed, not so fast as a man could swim. Notwithstanding their exertions and the advantage of their long start, they saw they were going to be overtaken. It could not be otherwise. There was nothing now to obstruct the pursuit, nothing to stay the pursuers. The sharks, having sated their appetites, had let most of the swimmers escape. Occasionally one was seen to go down with a shriek, but this was the exception. The rest swam freely on. What was their motive in following us? Was it vengeance, or a despairing hope of being saved? Perhaps both. But no matter which, there were enough of them to overpower the white men by sheer strength. And once they succeeded in reaching us, it was not likely they would fail to avenge themselves for the wrongs that had been put upon them. Should they succeed in overtaking the raft, they would easily climb upon it. A few might be kept back, but it would be impossible for 30 men to repulse hundreds, and the crowd would soon crawl over the edge, and with their additional weight sink the frail structure to the bottom of the sea. Should they succeed in reaching the raft, there was no need of any supposition. They would be certain to overtake it. Even at that moment, there were some of them scarce 10 yards off, and coming nearer at every fresh stroke of their arms. These, however, were the strongest swimmers, who were far ahead of the rest. The main body was still 20 yards further off, but it was plain that the slowest of them swam faster than the raft was moving. Most of the sailors began to give way to despair. The wicked deeds of an ill-spent life was rising before them. To all appearance, their last hour had come. And mine, too. At least, so believed I at that moment. It was hard to die thus, by such horrid means, and in such company. Sound in health, the love of life was strong within me, and under this impulse I almost repented what I had done. It was I who had brought about this last terrible contingency, and my own life was now to be the forfeit. Yes, I had acted imprudently, rashly, and I will not deny that at that moment I came near repenting of what I had done. It was not a time for reflection. The crisis had arrived. We must all yield up life. The sea would soon receive us within its ample embrace. Masters and slaves, tyrants and their victims, must all perish together. Such were the thoughts that were rushing through my brain as I saw the black swimmers approach. I no longer felt sympathy or pity for them. On the contrary, I viewed them as enemies, as dreaded monsters who were about to destroy and devour us, to engulf us all in one common destruction, and among the rest myself, their late benefactor. Really, at that moment, in the confusion of my thoughts, I was regarding these unfortunate creatures as though they were voluntary agents, as though they were actuated by gratuitous cruelty and revenge, and not victims of despair, struggling for the preservation of their own lives. My senses had become confused. My reasoning faculties had forsaken me, and in common with those around me, I regarded the pursuers as enemies. Under this impression, false though it may have been, I was the less disposed to sympathize with them. When I saw the first who came near the raft beaten back by the oars and handspikes of the sailors, for to this it had now come. It was a cruel scene that followed. I took no part in it. Though ever so desirous that my life should be saved, I could never have gone to such extremes to preserve it. I was but a looker-on. I saw the foremost swimmers struck upon the head, or pushed away by violent jabbing from the oars and handspikes. I saw some disappear below the surface, as if they had gone to the bottom under the blow, while others not injured swam off, and then circled round as if to get ahead of us. Though the fierce, angry shouts and the still fiercer actions of the white men intimidated the foremost swimmers, these demonstrations did not drive them away. They only kept out of reach of the oars and handspikes, but still followed on. Indeed, they no longer followed, for the raft was no longer in motion. The rowers had enough to do without propelling it further, and it had now come to a standstill. End of section 60. Chapter 61 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 61. It soon became evident that the foremost swimmers, who had been for the moment repulsed, had no intention of turning back. Why should they? Behind them they had left no hope, not a plank to cling to, only a ship on fire, blazing upward to the skies, and now almost hid under the flames. Even she, before they could reach her, would be burned down to the water's edge. Why should they think of swimming back? No, the raft was the only thing upon the whole face of that wide sea upon which human foot might now find a resting place. Though it would be but a straw among so many, at that straw had they determined to clutch, so long as life remained. They had no design of leaving us, but now swam round and round the floating spars, evidently waiting until their main body could come up, so that all might rush forward together and get possession of the raft. This was plainly their intention, and knowing it, the white men were fast yielding to despair. Not all of them. There were some of those rough men who still preserved their presence of mind, and in that perilous hour, when all hope appeared to have vanished, these men suddenly hit upon a plan to save the raft and the lives of those upon it from the apparently inevitable fate that threatened them. I was myself in a state of half stupor. I had watched the movements of the poor wretches in the water till my head grew giddy, and I scarce knew what was going on around me. My face was turned towards the blazing ship, and I had not for a long while looked elsewhere. I heard the sailors ejaculating loudly and shouting words of encouragement, but I suppose they were encouraging each other to repel the attack of the swimmers, who were now on all sides of the raft, forming a sort of irregular ring around it, of several feet in depth. I was expecting that we would soon be sinking into the sea. I was stupefied, and I thought I was dreaming. All of a sudden I was aroused from my stupor by hearing a loud huzzah. It came from the sailors behind me. I could not tell its meaning till I turned round, and then, to my surprise, I saw a piece of sail spread out transversely across the raft and held by several men in a vertical position. There was one at each end and one in the middle, who with their arms extended upward held the sail as high as they could reach. For what purpose were they doing this? I needed not ask the question. I saw that there was wind blowing against the canvas. I felt the breeze upon my cheeks. I looked back to the water. I saw that the raft was moving rapidly through it. There was a rushing along the edge of the timbers. There was froth where the spars were cleaving the sea. I looked for the swimmers. I saw their round heads and grim faces, but no longer around the raft. They were already in its wake, every moment falling further away. Merciful heaven! At least from that terrible fate were we saved. I kept gazing behind. I still saw the dark heads above the water. I could no longer distinguish their faces. I thought they had turned them away. I thought they were swimming back toward the blazing bark. They may have turned back, but with what hope? They could have had none, though despair may have driven them in that direction as well as any other. It was a sad beacon to guide them, nor did it serve them long. They could not have got near it. Not halfway before that event, so dreaded by Brace and myself, came to pass. The crisis had at length arrived. Wherever the powder had been kept, it was long before the fire had reached it, far longer than we had expected, but the searching flames found it at last, and the concussion came. It was a terrible explosion that resembled not the report of a cannon, but 100 guns simultaneously fired. Bed masses were projected far up into the heavens, and still farther out to the sea, hurtling and hissing as they fell back into the water. A cloud of fiery sparks hung for some minutes over the spot, but these at length came quivering down, and as soon as they reached the surface, were observed no more. These sparks were the last that was seen of the Pandora. The crew at this moment were awed into silence. There was silence far over the sea, yet for nearly another hour that silence was at intervals broken by the death shriek of some exhausted swimmer, or some victim of a ravening shark. The breeze still continued to blow. The raft moved on, and long before morning the Pandora's crew were carried far away from the scene of the terrible tragedy. End of section 61. Chapter 62 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 62. The breeze died away before the morning, and when day broke, there was not a breath stirring. The calm had returned, and the raft lay upon the water as motionless as a log. The men no longer tried to propel it. It could have served no purpose to make way, since, go in what direction we might, there would be hundreds of miles of the ocean to be crossed, and to sail a raft over that long distance was not to be thought of. Had there been a stock of provisions and water sufficient to have lasted for weeks, then such an idea would have been more feasible. But there was nothing of this. The idea of sailing in search of land was not entertained for a moment. The only hope was that a sail might appear in sight, that some ship might be passing across the ocean, and come sufficiently near to see us and pick us up. One and all were agreed that this was our only chance of being saved. A cheerless chance, it appeared when examined in all its bearings, so cheerless, indeed, that only the most sanguine of the party drew any hope from it. Notwithstanding the hundreds of thousands of ships that are constantly plowing the mighty deep and sailing from port to port, you will meet with but very few of them on any long voyage you may make. You may go from England to the Cape of Good Hope without seeing more than one or two sail during the whole passage, and yet that would be traveling upon one of the great highways of the ocean, in the track of all the ships sailing to the vast world of the East Indies, and also to those prosperous commercial colonies of Australia, whose mercantile marine almost rivals that of England herself. Again, you may cross the Atlantic upon another great waterway, that between Liverpool and New York, and yet between one port and the other you may see less than half a dozen sail, and sometimes only 2 or 3, during the whole of your voyage. Vast and wide are the highways of the great ocean. With the knowledge of these facts, but few of the men indulged in any very strong expectation of our coming in sight of a sail. We were in that very part of the Atlantic where the chances of such an encounter were few and far between. We were out of the line of navigation between any two great commercial countries, and although formerly Spanish vessels had traveled a good deal near the track we were in their intercourse with their South American colonies, this intercourse had been greatly diminished by revolution, and most of the traffic with these countries was now carried on in vessels belonging to the United States, and these were not likely to sail so far to the eastward as we were. Portuguese ships still traded to the Brazils in considerable numbers, and upon these we built most of our hopes. These and the chances that some ship engaged in the same traffic as the Pandora might be crossing westward with slaves, or returning for a fresh cargo. There was yet other vessels that occasionally navigated this part of the Atlantic, cruisers on their way from the African coast to the Brazils, or warships from Gibraltar, going round the Horn into the Pacific, or passing from the Cape of Good Hope to the West Indies. All these chances were eagerly brought forward by the men, and discussed with every circumstance of minuteness. Every point was produced that seemed to promise a hope of deliverance, for most, if not all, of these outlaws were seamen of experience, and well knew the ways of the ocean. Some held the opinion that our chances of being picked up were not so bad after all. There was a sail that could be rigged by means of oars and handspikes, and spread out so as to be visible from afar. Some ship would be certain to come along and see us, and then all would be right again. So talked those of more sanguine temperament, but the wiser ones shook their heads and doubted. They reasoned in an opposite strain, and made use of arguments the force of which could not be denied, and which produced great discouragement. There are some who seem always to prefer exhibiting the darker side of the picture, perhaps not from any pleasure that it gives them to do so, but by accustoming themselves to the worst view of the case they might be the better able to endure it when it comes. Otherwise, in the event of success, that they may derive all the greater enjoyment from the reaction. These last allege that the chances of meeting with any vessel in that solitary part of the ocean were slight, very slight indeed, that even if there were ships, hundreds of them, how could they approach the raft during a calm? Of course the ships would be becalmed, as they themselves were, and would have to remain so as long as the calm continued. This would be likely to last for weeks. And how were they to exist for weeks? How long would their provisions keep them alive? Not weeks. A few days, perhaps. Not more. These remarks led to an immediate examination of the stock of provisions that had been brought away from the wreck, and every article on the raft was now turned up and scrutinized. Strange to say, the only thing of which there was a tolerable supply was water. The large cask that had hitherto stood on deck, and which was still nearly half full, was now upon the raft. It had been bunged up and rolled overboard, and then safely deposited among the spars, where it floated of itself. What water may have been carried away in the gig no one knew, but certain it was that the cask was still nearly half full. This discovery produced a momentary cheerfulness, for in such cases water is usually the most important consideration, and ofttimes the very one that is neglected. But the joy was of short continuance. When every article upon the raft was overhauled, and every portion of it carefully searched, the only food that could be found was a small bag of biscuits, not enough to give 2 biscuits to each of us, not enough for a single meal. This astounded intelligence was received with cries of chagrin and looks of dismay. Some shouted in anger. One half incriminated the other. Some had been entrusted specially to provide the food. These alleged that a barrel of pork had been put upon the raft. Where was it? Certainly there was a barrel, but on breaking it open, to the dismay of all, it proved to be a barrel of pitch. A scene now ensued that it would be impossible to describe. Oaths, exclamations, and angry words passed freely, and the men almost came to blows. The pitch was thrown into the sea, and those who had put it upon the raft were threatened with a similar fate. Their negligence would prove fatal to all. But for them there might still have been a chance. But now what hope? With 2 biscuits apiece, how long could they exist? Not 3 days without suffering the extreme of hunger. Ere a week should pass, one and all must perish. The probability, nay, the positive certainty of such a doom produced a scene of despondence, mingled with angry excitement on the part of those who called themselves betrayed, that it would be difficult to paint. Harsh revilings were freely used, and threats of throwing the delinquents into the sea continued to be uttered at intervals during the whole night. There was still another barrel upon the raft that had been better left upon the burning wreck, but it was not likely that it should be forgotten. Its contents were of a nature too highly prized by the sailor who fears death by drowning, or any other sudden or violent means. It is supposed to make death easy, and therefore the despairing wretch clings to it as a friend. It is a sad resource, an awful termination to human existence, but often is it appealed to in the last moments of misery. I need not say that this barrel contained rum. End of section 62. Chapter 63 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 63. As soon as day dawned, every eye was bent upon the horizon. Not a point of the whole circle that was not scanned with the minutest earnestness by one and all. Round and round they turned, sweeping the surface with anxious glances and raising themselves as high as they could in order to command the most distant view. But all ended in disappointment. No sail was in sight. Nothing that had life or motion, not even fish or fowl, broke the monotony of that vast surface of sleeping water. There were no signs of the gig. She must have rowed off in some different direction. No signs either of the wreck. The breeze had carried us far from it. But even had we remained near, there might have been seen no traces of it. All had long since gone to the bottom of the sea. The sun rose higher and higher, and at noon stood right over our heads. We had no protection from his beams. they were almost hot enough to blister us. The calm continued. There was not enough motion in the air to have wafted a feather, and the raft lay as still as if it had been aground. It only moved when those who were on it passed from place to place. There was not much changing about. There was no great room for it. There were in all 34 of us, and the bodies of the men, some sitting and others lying, covered nearly the whole space. There was no reason for moving about. Most were sullen and despondent, and kept the places they had first taken, without the energy to stir out of them. Others were of lighter heart, or, under the influence of the rum which they drank freely, were more noisy. Now and then there was wrangling among them. The sea was frequently scanned, round and round, to the very borders of the sky. This duty was neither forgotten nor overlooked. There was always someone rising to his feet and gazing outward, but only to return to his former position, with that disheartening look that proclaimed how vain his reconnaissance had been. Indeed, silence itself was a sufficient reply. No one would have discovered a sail without making instant announcement of it. At noon we were all suffering from thirst. They who had been regaling themselves with rum worse than any, for this is the sure result. Water was served out from the cask, in equal quantity to each. It was agreed that all should share alike, both of the water and the bread, and of the former it was resolved that each should receive a pint a day. In any other situation the allowance might have been sufficient, and existence might be supported upon it. But under that broiling sun, that seemed to dry up the very blood in our veins, our thirst became almost insupportable, and the pint of water could be gulped down without affording the slightest relief. I am certain that half a gallon would scarce have sufficed to quench my thirst. What rendered the pint of water still more insufficient was that it was no longer cool water. The sun, basking down upon the cask that lay only half covered, had heated the staves and consequently the water within, to such a degree that the latter tasted as if halfway towards boiling. It may have checked the progress of thirst, but it did not alleviate the pain. The water might have been kept cooler by throwing the idle sail over the cask, but even this trifling precaution was not adopted. The men were gradually giving way to despair. The torpor of despondency was fast laying hold upon them, and under this influence no one seemed to possess energy enough for any precaution, however easy it might have been. As to the serving out of the food, that occupied only one act. To be put upon daily allowance out of such a store was altogether out of the question. A simple partition was all that was required, and the bag of biscuit was emptied out and its contents equally divided around. There proved to be 2 biscuits apiece, with a small surplus, and for this last the crew held a raffle, each time a single biscuit forming the prize. For these prizes the men contended with as much eagerness as if there had been large sums of money staked on the result, and indeed it would have been a large sum that would have purchased one of these precious morsels of bread. The raffling, combined with the rum, which was now also meted out, produced for some time a noisy excitement, but this was soon over, and the sullen silence of despondency again ruled. Some, already ravenous with hunger and reckless of consequences, ate their 2 biscuits at once, while others, endowed with greater prudence or stronger powers of endurance, only gnawed a small portion, and kept the rest towards a future and more pressing necessity. Thus passed the time till near sunset, with no event to cheer us, no new prospect to beget a hope. When near sunset, however, a grand excitement was produced, and all the sweet joys of hope were again felt. One of the men, who had arisen to his feet, and was gazing over the sea, suddenly cried out, "A sail! A sail!" It would be impossible to describe the wild joy that these words produced. Men leaped to their feet, vociferating glad huzzas as they repeated the words, "A sail! A sail!" Some pulled off their hats and waved them in the air. Some leaped and danced about as though frantic, and even the most despairing behaved as if suddenly called to a new life. I have said it would be impossible to picture that scene, but still more impossible to describe the contrast which, but the moment after, might have been witnessed upon the raft, when it was ascertained that the cry was a false alarm. No sail was in sight. There had been none. Nothing could be seen of ship or sail over the wide circle of the ocean. Nothing moved upon the glass-like face of that vast mirror. A false alarm, entirely without foundation. Why the man had uttered it was soon explained. The wild expressions that were pouring from his lips, with the grotesque gestures he was making with his arms, proved that he was mad. End of chapter 63. Chapter 64 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 64. Yes, the man was mad. The awful occurrences of the preceding night had deprived him of his reason, and he was now a raving maniac. Some cried out to throw him into the sea. No one opposed this counsel. It would have been carried into execution, for several were prepared to lay hold of him when the maniac, apparently well aware of their intention, scrambled back into his former position, and cowering down, remained silent and scared-like. It was not probable he would harm anyone. He was left alone. The excitement of this incident soon passed away, and the gloomy looks returned, if possible, gloomier than before. For it is ever so after hopes have been raised that terminate in disappointment. So passed the evening and a portion of the night. At the same hour as upon the preceding night, almost the same minute, the breeze again sprung up. It could be of little service, since there was no chance of our being carried by it to land. But it was cool and refreshing after the intense, torrid heat we had been all day enduring. Some were for spreading the sail, others saw no use in it. "What good can it do?" inquired these. "It may carry us a score of miles hence, or perhaps twice that. What then? It won't bring us in sight of land, nor a ship neither. We're as likely to see one by lying still. What's the use of moving about, if we haven't the wherewith to eat, and must make a die of it? We may as well die here, as a score of knots farther to the leeward. Set your sail, if you will. We won't either hinder or help." Such language was used by the despairing part of the crew. There were those who thought that by sailing we should be more likely to fall in with a vessel. They thought they could not be worse, and might drift to a better place, where ships were more frequent, though they acknowledged that there were equal chances of their going away out of the track. The truth is that no one knew within 100 miles of where we were, and to sail in any course would have been mere guesswork. By men in misery, however, motion is always preferred to rest, and the knowledge that you are going and going forward produces a soothing influence on the spirits. It begets a hope that you will come in sight of something that may aid you, and these hopes, however ill-founded, enable you to pass the time more lightly. On the contrary, by remaining in one fixed place for a like period of time, you fret and chafe much more under the uncertainty. With this feeling upon them, most of the men were in favor of bending the sail, and it was accordingly bent. The night before it had been held aloft by several of the men, as the only object then had been to get the raft beyond reach of the swimmers. When that end was accomplished, the sail had been allowed to drop, and the raft had drifted a good distance without it. Tonight, however, a mast was raised, or rather a pair of them, consisting of oars and handspikes spliced together, and between the two the canvas was extended, without yard, gaff, or boom. There was no design to maneuver the sail. It was just spread like a blanket, transversely to the raft, and left for the breeze to blow upon it as it listed. When this was done, the raft was left to its own guidance, and of course drifted to leeward as fast as it could make way, apparently, at the rate of 3 or 4 knots an hour. The men once more resumed their recumbent positions, and all remained silent. Some fell asleep and snored as though they were happy. Others slept, but their dream-talking told of troubled visions, recalling maybe dark scenes of guilt. A few seemed to lie awake all the livelong night, at intervals tossing about, as though kept on the alert by thirst, hunger, or the apprehension of approaching death. Brace and I sat close together. We still occupied the slight raft he had made, as there was but little room upon the other, and this one, now forming part of the whole structure, was as good a position as we could have chosen, in fact the best, as the sequel proved. There was a sail upon it, the jib or flying jib, I know not which, and a piece of old tarpauling, and these spread over the planks, kept them together, and gave us a softer bed to recline upon. We conversed together at times, though not often. Now and then the brave sailor had endeavored to cheer me by holding out hopes, but so hopeless had our situation now become that he at length desisted. He felt that it would be only mockery to hold out the slightest prospect of our deliverance. He, too, the bravest of all that blind, was fast surrendering himself to despair. The breeze died away before daybreak, just as on the previous night, and another morning came, but showed no sail on all that boundless sea. Another hot sun rose and circled overhead through that same cloudless heaven, and set red and fiery as ever. There passed another night, and once more the wind carried us through the water, and then several other days and nights, I ceased to count them, came and went with almost the same monotonous routine, varied only by bickerings among the men, sometimes most fiendish quarrels, in which knives were drawn, and used almost with fatal effect. Strange time for disagreement and deadly conflict. Even wild animals, the fiercest beasts of prey, when under the influence of a common danger, will yield up the ferocity of their nature. Not so these wicked men. Their vile passions, in this dread hour, seemed almost to become stronger and more malignant. Their quarrels were about the merest trifles, the serving out of the water, the rum, the supposition of someone that he was not getting fair play in his allowance, but so frequent had they become that they themselves grew to be a monotony. Every hour a fierce brawl disturbed a deep repose and otherwise breathless silence that characterized the intervals between them. If these incidents had grown monotonous and no longer failed to interest me, there was one upon the eve of occurring that was well calculated to produce within me an interest of the most powerful kind, calculated to stir my soul to its very utmost emotion. I have said that this incident was on the eve of occurring. It was a hideous purpose already matured, though kept secret from my companion and myself. Neither Brace nor I had the slightest suspicion of it until the hour in which it was openly declared. End of chapter 64. Chapter 65 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 65. It was probably on the 6th day after parting from the wreck, though I'm not certain about the day, that the horrid design reached its development. It had been hatching for a while before, and upon that day came to a crisis. It was now several days since food had been tasted by anyone. The 2 biscuits each had been long since eaten, most of them at the moment of being given out. Of course, everyone upon the raft was suffering the pangs of hunger, and had been enduring them until the appetite had reached the extremity of painfulness. Some looked emaciated, with eyes deeply sunken and cheeks bony and hollow. Others, strange to say, had a fat, bloated appearance, but this must have arisen from swelling or some unnatural cause. It could not be that famine had given them flesh. All, one and all, had that peculiar expression about the eyes and about the mouth that may be noticed in the visage of a hungry dog, or still more perceptibly in a half-starved wolf. About this period there seemed to be some secret intelligence among them, not all of them, but among those who acted as leaders, for even in their reduced condition there were those of stronger body and more energetic spirit who maintained a sort of leadership over the rest. What this intelligence was, I could not tell, nor indeed should I have taken notice of the indications of its existence, had it not been for what occurred afterwards. I observed them now and then whispering to one another, as they did so casting side glances towards Brace and myself. At other times I caught now one and now another, gazing upon me, and with a wild, wolfish look that rendered me, though I could not tell why, singularly uneasy. I noticed that they appeared as if they did not like to be detected while thus looking at me, and ever as I returned their glances, they suddenly lowered their eyes and averted their faces. They then appeared as men who had been detected in some mean or guilty action. As it appeared to me that they looked in a similar manner at my companion, and at one another as well, I fancied that the strange expression that had struck me must be one characteristic of extreme hunger, and I thought no more about it. On the following day, however, I observed that the whispering among them increased, and was accompanied with a greater variety of gesticulation and excitement. Brace also noticed it, and guessed better than I what all this Freemasonry meant. At least he was nearer the truth, for he was still ignorant of the full purpose of those ruffian conspirators. He whispered to me what he supposed they were after, with the design of breaking the terrible truth to me as gently as possible. But I had now better than half divined it, and his communication did not startle me. "Someone gotta die, lad. I suppose they're talking of casting lots who it'll be. Well, we must take our chance among the rest." Just as Brace had finished his speech, one of the men rose up upon the raft, and calling the attention of the others, begged to make a proposal to them. The speech by which he introduced his proposal was brief, indeed, and to the point. In fact, he came to the proposition almost at once, which was simply that one of the party must die to save the rest, that they had still water, but no food, and all must perish unless they could eat, that they could not eat unless— But I cannot repeat the dread arguments which he made use of, brief though they were, for his speech was short, and having delivered it, he sat down again. There was a short pause, and then another rose and addressed the crowd. The man coincided in the views of him who had spoken, and added to the proposal a suggestion for carrying it out. That was, that the one who was to die should be chosen by lot. This, of course, both Brace and myself expected. It was not likely that any one was going to volunteer. What was my terror and the anger and alarm of my companion when one of the strongest and most brutal of the whole crew, the ruffian Legros, rose up, and in a loud and serious tone not only objected to drawing lots, but proposed me for the victim. Brace sprang instantly to his feet and uttered a cry of indignation. It was expected that this cry would have been echoed by the others, and with almost any other band of men upon the face of the earth or the face of the ocean, such would have been the reception of the foul proposal. But both my companion and I soon perceived with dismay that there came no such echo from that ruffian crew. On the contrary, several backed the proposal itself, and in such majority, I might almost say unanimity, that it was plain that most of the men who spoke had already predetermined the case. It was evident from their prompt acquiescence that they had been prepared for it, and this accounted for that mysterious whispering that had been carried on during the preceding day. Some few evidently had not been in the secret, but these were weak individuals whose opposition would not have been regarded, and who indeed appeared ready enough to chime in with the majority. The French bully went on to justify his proposition by argument. We were not all equal, he said. There were able seamen and common sailors, and I was but a boy. Why should I have a chance like the rest? It was preposterous. Brace opposed his arguments, appealed to the crew, to their sense of justice and fair play. Let lots be cast, said he, and let him take his chance with the rest. That was the only fair and honest mode, the only way worthy of men. Bah! These were not men. One and all were but too glad to grasp at any means that would deliver them from the perilous raffle. The sophistic arguments of Legros satisfied them. The infamous motion prevailed. It was decreed that I should die. End of chapter 65. Chapter 66 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 66. Yes, it was decreed that I should die. The time and the mode alone remained to be determined. But these points were soon settled. For the former, it was to be then, instantly, and as to the mode, I was to be bled to death. These resolves were made with a dispatch that allowed no time for reflection, scarcely time for speech or protestation. The ferocious wolves were eager for their prey. It was their determination to act promptly to the time, for without further hesitation, half a dozen of the most forward in the business advanced towards me, evidently with the intent to put their design into execution. And beyond a doubt they would have done it, had I been alone and unprotected. Beyond a doubt they would have killed and eaten me. But I was not alone. I was not without a protector. As the fierce cannibals advanced, Brace sprang between them and me, and drawing his clasp knife, threatened to cut down the first who should lay a finger upon me. "Off," cried he, "off, you cowardly swabs! Lay your hand upon the lad, and I'll make mince meat of ye. He may be the first to be eaten, but he aren't the first that'll die for it. There's more than one of ye'll kick the bucket before he does. Blowed if they're cowardly hounds. Come on, if you dare." The dastards, cowed by the intrepid bearing of Brace, halted in their advance and hung back, though no one of them ventured a reply. They seemed to have been taken by surprise, for although they knew that Brace opposed the design, they had no idea he would attempt to struggle against the whole crew. Surprise, therefore, held them back, mingled with some little fear for the determined attitude which Brace had taken, and the shining blade of his knife promised death to some of them, and as each feared it might be himself, no one desired to be the foremost. I had thrown myself alongside my brave protector, resolving to do battle and die by his side, though not much could my puny arm have effected against the host of strong, ferocious men who assailed us. Still, it would be better to die thus than to be butchered in cold blood, and under this belief I nerved myself for the encounter. At this crisis a change appeared to take place in the attitude of my companion. Some new thought had struck him, and waving his hand in a peculiar manner which signified to our antagonists that he had some proposal to make, he succeeded in obtaining silence. He then addressed them as follows: "Comrades, aren't it too bad there should be quarreling atween us at such a time as this, when we're all in trouble alike?" Brace's late tone of defiance had changed to one of half entreaty, and it was evident he was about to propose some compromise. Indeed, it would have been madness in him to have carried the conflict farther, as it could only have resulted in the death of us both. "Comrades," he continued, "it's a dreadful thing to die, but I know that some one must be made a sacrifice for the rest, and that are better than we should all go. Ye must know, then, when this thing happens, it be the usual way to draw lots about it." "We shan't have it that way," cried one, adding to his response the emphasis of an oath. "Well, then," continued Brace, without losing his pacific demeanour, "since you're agreed that it shan't be that way, and that the boy must be the first, and since you're all agreed to it, it's no use of me standing in the way. I agree to it wi' the rest." I was startled at the words, and involuntarily turned my eyes upon the face of the speaker. Was he serious? Was he really about to give me up? To surrender me into the hands of those ruthless men? He took no notice of me, and his unflinching attitude and glance, still bent in the same direction, told me that he had not yet done speaking. "But," said he, after pause, "with these conditions." "What conditions?" asked several, interrupting him. "Why, only this," replied Brace, "that the boy be let live till the morning. I only ask for him till the sun rises, and then, if there be no sail in sight, ye can do as ye please. It's only fair that the lad should have a chance for his life, and if you don't agree to give him this chance," continued the speaker, once more placing himself in a determined attitude, "if you don't, then all I've got to say is, that I'll fight for the lad as long as I can stand over him, and if he be the first ate, he won't be the first killed. That I can promise ye. Now." Brace's speech produced the desired effect. His auditory, though reluctantly, agreed to the proposal. Even those heartless fiends could not help acknowledging that it was no more than fair. But perhaps the determined and resolute bearing of my protector, as he stood drawn up and ready, with that keen blade shining in his strong firm grasp, had more influence upon their decision than any feeling of fair play. Whether or not the reprieve was granted, and those who had been menacing my life drew back, though still muttering their discontent, and shrunk once more into their places. End of section 66. Chapter 67 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 67. I can ill describe the emotions that agitated my bosom. Though delivered from the terror of immediate death, there was nothing in the respite to give me any feeling of joy. It would be only a short procrastination of my doom, for certainly in the morning I must die. The slender chances of our seeing a sail were scarce worth contemplating, and I derived no consolation by dwelling upon such a contingency. My fate, therefore, I looked upon as sealed. My protector could not save me. He had done the utmost in his power in procuring the reprieve that was to give me this slight chance for my life. If it failed, he would undoubtedly have to keep his word and surrender me up. I felt as the condemned criminal whose hour of execution has been fixed, and who knows it, with perhaps only the difference that I could look forward to the event with a clear conscience. I felt not as a criminal, but as a victim, a martyr among ruffians. Of course I thought not of sleep. All sleep was banished from my eyelids. With such a prospect before me, how could I sleep? Sadly, at that crisis did I think of home, of parents and kindred. Bitterly did I repent that I ever ran away to sea. Alas, like many others who have acted disobediently and rashly, my experience had been too dearly purchased. My repentance came too late. Tomorrow, by sunrise, must I die. And oh, such a dreadful doom! My fate would never be known, for though I was made a sacrifice, it was not likely that my executioners would long survive me. The chances that any of them would ever reach land were slight indeed, and even if they should, it was not likely they would ever divulge that secret. I should never more be heard of. Neither friends or kindred would ever know my sad fate, and it would be better that they should not know. Oh, it was a dreadful doom. Suffering under such reflections, I lay stretched upon the plank. My protector was still by my side, so near that our shoulders touched, and our heads were close together. I could have heard anything he might have said, though uttered only in a whisper. But for a long time he did not address a word to me. He appeared to be busied with his own thoughts, as if buried in some deep cogitation, and did not desire to be spoken to. Noticing this, I, too, remained silent. The night came down and promised to be dark. Most of the preceding nights had been very clear, as there had been moonlight and scarce a cloud in the sky for weeks before. On this day, however, and particularly towards the close of it, black clouds had shown themselves above the horizon, and although the sea was still under a calm, it appeared as if some change was at hand. After the sun had set, these clouds rose higher and higher, until a black pall of them covered the whole firmament, completely shrouding the moon, and not only hiding her from our eyes, but hindering her beams from casting their light over the sea. The surface of the water, instead of glittering around us, as it had done upon previous nights, was now of a gray, gloomy complexion, for it reflected the color of the clouds that hung over it. Both wore fit emblems of my own sad spirit. Almost mechanically, I remarked to my companion this change in the heavens, and spoke about the darkness of the night. "So much the better, lad," was his laconic reply, and he again relapsed in silence, as if he did not desire to be led into conversation. I lay for a while pondering upon his reply. How was it better? What signified the darkness? What advantage could be gained by that? A dark night could not bring ships upon the sea, nor could it save me from the doom that had been decreed. The sun would rise all the same, and at his rising I must die. The darkness could not avail me. What could he mean? I pondered a long while upon his answer, but could not make out its signification. Had he intended it as a phrase of encouragement? Something to hold out a hope to me? Something to cheer me? For indefinitely it had this effect. Or was the answer given mechanically and without thought? The former I dared not hope. Since the moment in which my respite had been granted, he had not spoken nor offered a word of hope. For certain was I that he had none to offer. What then meant he by the words he had just uttered? So much the better, lad? I would at length have asked him, but just as I had made up my mind to do so, I perceived that he was twisting himself about, and before I could speak to him, he had turned his head away, so that he could no longer have heard me in a whisper. Not desirous that others should overhear the question I was about to put to him, I remained silent, and waited for a better opportunity. End of chapter 67. Chapter 68 of Ran Away to Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid. Section 68. It had now grown extremely dark, so much so that I could scarce distinguish the form of my companion, though he was close by me, and the great raft itself, with the bodies reclining upon it, was only distinguishable as a shapeless black mass. I could perceive the spread sail better than anything else, as this was of a whitish color, and stood up outlined against the gloomy gray of the sky. But dark as it was, I noticed that Brace, on turning away from me, had his knife clasped in his hand, with the blade still open and ready for use. What could he intend with this? All at once it occurred to me that he suspected something, that he was apprehensive that the ruffians might not desire to wait for the morning as agreed, but might attempt to carry out their purpose in the night. And under this suspicion he had placed himself between them and me, determined to keep guard over me. The position he had taken gave color to this supposition, and the attitude he was in almost confirmed it. As I have before stated, Brace and I still occupied the floating planks, which we had bound together, and these were attached to the raft at what might be called its stern. That is, when the raft moved through the water by means of sail, our position was behind and in the wake. Now, as my companion had turned himself, he lay with his head towards the raft, and as I thought, in a half-crouching attitude. Though the pitchy darkness prevented me from being sure of this, at all events he was so placed that any one attempting to approach me must first pass over his body, and therefore did I believe, seeing the knife in his grasp, that his object was to guard me. I have said that it had now grown extremely dark, but in addition to this, I perceived that the breeze had arisen just about the same hour as on other nights. This night, however, it was much fresher than before, so fresh that the raft swept briskly along, making a rushing noise in the water and leaving a foamy track behind her. Lulled into a kind of stupor, I lay for some time listening to this noise, and was only aroused from my reverie by observing that the sound of the water became all at once less loud and distinct, as though the raft was moving more gently through the sea. Then I ceased to hear it altogether. Surely, thought I, the sail has come down, and the raft is no longer in motion. I lay for a while, listening attentively. To my surprise, I could still distinguish the sound of rushing water, but it now appeared as if at some distance, and every moment getting further away. I was about to spring up and seek an explanation of this strange phenomenon when a wild cry came pealing across the water, followed by a confused noise of loud voices. "We're saved," thought I. "Some ship is near." And I actually shouted these words as I sprang up from my recumbent attitude. "Yes," replied a voice, which I knew to be that of Brace. "We're saved from them, anyhow. Yonder they go, the cowardly swabs. They don't catch us while the breeze lasts. That they don't." To my astonishment, I now perceived that Brace and I were alone, and far in the shadowy darkness I could just make out the white sail of the raft, still scudding away before the breeze. There was no mystery about it. Brace had cut the ropes that had bound our planks to the raft, and had silently permitted them to drop astern. That was what he had been doing with his knife. Of course, the wind, acting upon the sail, had soon carried the great raft far out of reach, and it was now several hundred yards to leeward of us. The darkness had prevented any of the crew from noting what was passing, but they had at length discovered our escape, as their wild shouts and angry vociferations testified. We could hear them calling us by name, at the same time uttering threats and cries of disappointed rage. "Don't fear them any more," coolly remarked my companion. "Can't reach us with that slow craft. We can row faster than they can swim. But best make sure, however. The farther we're from 'em, the better. Lay hold, lad. Here's an oar for you. Pull with all your might." I took the oar, as my companion directed, and commenced rowing. I saw that Brace had another oar, which he had managed to bring away from the raft, and under the two blades our little craft was propelled rapidly through the water. Of course, we rowed right into the wind's eye, but by so doing we took the opposite direction to that in which the crew was carried. For a long time we continued to hear their wild, hoarse cries behind us, but the voices grew fainter and fainter as the raft drifted to leeward, and at length we could hear them no more. We rowed on till morning light, and then resting from our toil, we stood up and scanned the surface of the sea. There was no sail in sight, no object of any kind. The raft had disappeared behind the convex swell of the water. We were all alone upon the ocean. Reader, I might describe other scenes of peril through which my brave companion and I passed, before that joyful hour when our eyes rested upon the white sails of a ship, a strong, fine ship that lifted us from the bosom of the ocean and carried us once more to land. Aye, even to our native land. I shall not weary you with the details. Suffice it to say that we were rescued, else how could I be living to tell the tale? Yes, I still live, and so does my companion. Both of us still follow the sea, but no longer under the rule of an arbitrary tyrant such as the captain of the Pandora. No, we are both captains ourselves. I of an East India man, and Ben the master, and part owner, too, of a fine bark in the African trade, a bark quite equal to the Pandora. But not that African trade, no. My old friend is an honest dealer. His merchandise is not black men, but yellow gold dust, white ivory, palm oil, and ostrich plumes. And after each trip to the African coast, Ben, as I have been given to understand, makes a trip to the Bank of England, and there deposits a very considerable sum of money. I rejoice in his prosperity, and I have no doubt that you, reader, will do the same. We are not ignorant of the fate of the slaver's crew. Not one of them, either those in the gig or on the raft, ever again saw the shore. They perished upon the face of the wide ocean, miserably perished, without hand to help, or eye to weep over them. No eye beheld them, but that of the Omnipotent. No hand, but His was near, and it was near, for it was the hand of God that avenged their victims. The end. End of section 68. End of Ran Away to Sea by Thomas Mayne Reid.